Hello and welcome to Hidden Dusk, a place where the night grows quiet and the shadows begin to tell their stories. Before we begin, dim the lights, get comfortable and relax. And if you enjoy calm and eerie stories like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, let the darkness guide you into tonight's story. My family moved into a quaint, colonial-style home about 7 years ago. Built in 1900, it had charm and character, and our historic town only added to its appeal. At the time, my wife was very pregnant with our son, and my stepdaughter, who I'll call Kayla, was 5. From the moment we moved in, though, odd things began happening. On our very first day, as my wife and I were unpacking dishes, Kayla walked in and said, "Mommy," a shadow man walked out of my closet and disappeared into the wall. It gave me chills, but as a skeptic, I brushed it off. We were busy, and I wasn't one to believe in ghosts. But it turns out that was just the beginning. A few weeks later, my wife began mentioning strange noises coming from upstairs, especially from Kayla's room. She described it as the sound of a rubber ball bouncing on the wooden floors and rolling down the hall. Our entire house had bare wood floors, so it was easy to imagine how sounds might echo. I dismissed it as an overactive imagination, but she kept mentioning it. She even told me about toys moving on their own in the living room. The strange activity went on for months. One Saturday afternoon, when I was alone, I finally heard it for myself. I was watching TV when I heard a sound at the top of the stairs, like someone smacking their bare feet against the wood. It was so loud that I didn't need to lower the volume to hear it. The realization struck me. It could easily sound like a bouncing ball, just as my wife had described. After that, I began to notice more of these strange noises and unexplained movements around the house. Several years passed, and my wife and I began having marital issues, which eventually led me to start sleeping on the couch. It was during this period, as I spent more nights in the living room, that I became convinced that something was truly haunting our home. Neither of my kids would sleep upstairs by then. They'd seen and heard too much and were terrified. My wife and the kids took over our bedroom, and I would either sleep on the couch or sometimes in my son's empty room upstairs. One night, as I lay on the couch, I was woken by the familiar smacking sound. Only this time, it was directly behind my head, right near the armrest. I was so terrified I couldn't bring myself to look. I held my breath, hoping it would stop. Then, to my horror, I felt the entire couch bump forward an inch as though something was pushing it from behind. I lay there frozen, unable to move or look, but completely awake and aware of the terrifying presence behind me. Another night on the couch, I woke up from a deep sleep and saw what looked like a mass of hairy spider-like legs, each about 15 inches long, swirling in a spiraling shape right in front of my face. They rotated counterclockwise, forming a strange, intricate shape. I sat there, wide-eyed, fully conscious and unable to believe what I was seeing. Just as suddenly as they had appeared, the legs dissolved into a smoke-like mist. After that, I started sleeping upstairs more often, but strange things continued. One night, I heard knocking sounds coming from behind the wall, seemingly from Kayla's closet. The knocking would get louder and more frequent until I'd have to turn up the TV just to drown it out. Finally, one night, I shouted, "Stop! Leave me alone!" To my amazement, the noise stopped. I hadn't heard it again since. The first time I actually saw an apparition was unforgettable. It was late. Everyone else was asleep and I was watching the news. I glanced toward the kitchen and saw what I thought was Kayla peeking around the corner. The kitchen light was on, and it cast her face in shadow, but I could tell it was a small figure. I told her to go back to bed, and she disappeared. A few minutes later, I saw her again, peeking around the same corner. Frustrated, I told her to get back to bed, this time more firmly. But when she reappeared yet again, I got up to put her back in bed myself. When I opened her door, I found her sound asleep, drooling on her pillow. Whoever, or whatever, I had seen peeking around the corner wasn't Kayla. As time went on, our house gained a reputation among friends and family as haunted. Everyone who spent the night had their own strange experiences. I always joke with skeptics, telling them, Spend a night at my place, and you'll believe in ghosts. Things took a darker turn just last year after my wife and I separated. Our son, David, stayed with me, and one day, I woke from a nap on the couch with a distinct bite mark on my arm. At first, I thought I'd somehow done it to myself in my sleep, but when I tried to recreate the position, I realized it was impossible for me to have left the mark. A few months later, I met a wonderful woman, Ashley, who has 4 young children. After dating for several months, she and her kids moved in. That's when things really escalated. One day, David, who had just turned 6, was taking a bath with Ashley's 3-year-old son, Evan, when I heard him crying out for me. I ran upstairs, finding him sobbing and saying, "Daddy, I want you. Daddy, I want you." He wouldn't say why he was so upset at first. Later that night, while Ashley and I sat on the porch, she gently asked him what had happened. He told us that a boy he could see had hit him in the face while he was in the tub. What he told us next sent chills down my spine. David explained that Alan, who he had thought was a boy, was actually a large man, bigger than me, and I'm 6 feet tall and 300 pounds. David described him as wearing a white shirt with black stripes, jeans, and carrying roses in his back pocket. When I asked what the roses were for, David said Alan had a girlfriend named Amy, but he no longer made love to her and gave roses to another girl. My 6-year-old didn't even know what making love meant. When I pressed him on what had happened in the bath, he explained that Alan had come into the bathroom, used the toilet, then smacked him in the face. Alan had tried to hit Evan too, but his hand passed right through him since Evan couldn't see him. At this point, I told David to tell Alan that if he wanted to speak to someone, he should come speak to me. David looked at an empty chair and calmly said, "Dad, he's sitting right there. You can tell him yourself." I felt a cold chill wash over me. That night, when I finally confronted Alan, things spiraled. As Ashley and I were going to bed, my phone's Siri activated on its own. To get a response, you need to press the button and speak into the phone, but I hadn't touched it. It happened again 2 nights later, right after Ashley and I had been intimate. This time, Siri responded with vile, explicit phrases that made us both uneasy. Ever since I acknowledged Alan's presence, strange things have been happening nonstop. Loud bangs, doors opening and slamming shut, voices, and shadows are constant. Electronics fail, objects are moved, and Ashley and I often feel as if we're under attack. I reached out to a family friend who connected me to paranormal investigators. They agreed to do a walkthrough, and as soon as they entered, they felt the energy and saw and heard things themselves. They even brought skeptics who left completely changed by what they experienced. During the investigation, flashlights turned on and off on command, shadows moved, and the red K2 meters spiked in every room. They captured voices, heard strange sounds, and even saw dolls moving. They collected so much evidence that they didn't have time to focus on cleansing the house. Now, I'm waiting to hear back about how to proceed with a full cleansing. Every day since then, something happens. Just last night, I felt something rubbing my shoulder as I tried to sleep. When I woke up this morning, the TV was on by itself. This haunting has been ongoing, and while I may not have the patience to detail every single incident, it's clear that whatever is in my house has no plans to leave quietly. I guess I'll just dive right in. Up until this unexplainable experience, I was a solid skeptic. I've only shared this story with a few close friends and family members, but most of them seem to think I'm crazy. I thought maybe sharing it with people who are open to the possibility of spirits might help me get some thoughtful responses rather than doubtful stares. It was May 2005. My grandfather, whom we affectionately called Papa, had recently undergone quadruple bypass surgery. He needed some extra help around the house while he recovered. Since I could take another month off from work, I volunteered to fly out from Michigan to Chesapeake Beach, Maryland, with my 3-month-old daughter. It would be a chance for my family to meet the newest addition and to lend a hand to Papa as he healed. Thankfully, his recovery went smoothly. To give a bit of context, my grandparents' house was a cozy ranch-style home that they designed themselves, built in 1989. You'd enter through the garage, where a short hallway led to the family room with a deck stretching across the back of the house. To the left was the laundry room, to the right, a guest bathroom. The kitchen was off to one side of the family room, and past that was the dining room, also with doors opening to the back deck. If you kept walking, you'd hit the living room, and to the left were all the bedrooms and bathrooms. During my stay, I decided to sleep in the family room rather than the spare bedroom. It was perfect. There was more space for the baby's crib, swing, and toys, and it gave me easy access to the kitchen for late-night feedings. Plus, I was far enough from my grandfather's room that I wouldn't disturb him if the baby cried. I had everything set up for a comfortable stay. One night, around 2:30 a.m., my daughter woke up for a feeding. I got her settled, changed her, and fed her back to sleep. By the time I laid her down and turned off the kitchen light, it was closer to 3 a.m. I was wide awake, so I decided to flip through TV channels in search of a mindless rerun to lull me back to sleep. After a few minutes, though, I began to hear a strange noise coming from the dining room. Curious, I turned down the TV volume to listen. Silence. A minute or two passed before the sound returned, louder this time. The distinct sound of door handles jiggling, as if someone were trying to open the double doors in the dining room. My first thought was that someone was trying to break in from the deck. I called out for my grandfather, but there was no response. I lay there, too scared to peek over the back of the couch. My mind raced, weighing options. If someone was breaking in, the blinds were closed, and I triple-checked that all the doors were locked. If needed, I could grab my daughter and run through the garage to a neighbor's house. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Silence settled over the house once more. I lay there for what felt like forever, my heart pounding in the stillness, waiting for some other sound or sign of movement. Eventually, I mustered the courage to sit up and peer into the dimly lit kitchen. The faint glow from the TV cast enough light to reveal the dining room doors, still closed, locked, and undisturbed. Relieved, I laid back down, thinking I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I heard footsteps. The sound came from the kitchen, distinct and deliberate, as if someone were slowly walking across the creaky linoleum floor. The footsteps moved slowly but steadily, inching closer to the family room. I lay frozen, every hair on my arms and neck standing up as the steps came closer. Then they stopped right behind the couch. I held my breath, expecting something, anything, but there was nothing. No retreating footsteps, no more creaks, just an intense, looming silence. But then, as I lay there, that gripping fear began to fade. In its place was a strange, almost overwhelming calm. I felt peaceful, enveloped in a sense of warmth and safety. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually, I drifted off to sleep. And that's it, that's my story. Compared to some of the other experiences I've read about, it's mild. I can't explain it, though. I should mention that my grandmother had passed away in her sleep in that house in 1998. I'd spent countless nights there after her passing, but I'd never experienced anything like this before. I can't say for certain that it was her, but in the quiet calm that followed, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe she'd come back, just briefly, to remind me that I wasn't alone. What do you think? Back in 2001/2002, I lived in a house on an old army base in what was once World War II-era housing. I was a military wife, raising my 3-year-old daughter and 1-year-old son. At the time, I had a few odd experiences, but it took years after moving out to finally piece them all together. It all began one evening when I was on a long-distance call with my father. I was cooking dinner, and my son was in his high chair in the dining room. The layout of the house was typical for old base housing. The dining room was on one side of the kitchen, and the foyer, where the main front entrance was on the other. If you walked into the house from the foyer, the kitchen was to your left, the living room straight ahead, and the stairs to the 3 bedrooms were on the right. I emphasize the foyer because, as I'd later realize, most of the strange happenings seemed to center around that part of the house. So there I was, talking with my dad, cooking dinner, when the door between the foyer and the kitchen started moving on its own. It swung back and forth, not randomly, but with a steady, precise motion, just a few inches in both directions. There was no breeze, no drafts, and it was unlike anything I'd seen in the house before. My dad, listening on the other end, was surprisingly calm. "Sounds like someone's trying to say hi," he said with an almost amused tone. I brushed it off with a shrug. I'd always been open to the possibility of something beyond our understanding, and I didn't feel threatened, only curious. Earlier that day, I'd heard what I thought was my husband calling me from upstairs. It sounded muffled, but clear enough that I called back, asking what he needed. When I got no response, I called again, still no answer. So I put my dad on hold and ran upstairs to check. My husband was in bed, fast asleep, recovering from a migraine. When I asked if he'd called me, he was too groggy to make much sense. I figured it must have been the neighbors, although I didn't really hear any sounds from them. At the time, it didn't feel like anything significant. But months later, something similar happened, only this time it was 5 a.m., and my husband was already out for his early training. I was in bed when I heard that same muffled voice, calling my name from somewhere in the foyer. I assumed he'd come back early and was calling up to me, so I called out, expecting him to answer. But there was no reply. I got up, went to the top of the stairs and looked down, expecting to see him. But the foyer was empty. Puzzled, I checked the window to see if his car was there, but he was still gone. The experience left me feeling uneasy, but in the middle of busy family life, I soon put it out of my mind. It wasn't until years later that I started piecing these events together with other small incidents that I hadn't paid much attention to at the time. One of the oddest memories involved my baby boy. He went through a phase where he'd wake up in the middle of the night, crying, so I'd bring him downstairs to comfort him. As we'd sit there, he would fixate on the foyer, waving at something unseen, and saying hi over and over. It struck me as odd, but I chalked it up to him being a toddler with an active imagination. Around 12:30 a.m., I woke to the sound of loud banging from the large room. It was as if someone were punching the metal lockers. Half asleep, I assumed it was some elaborate prank and figured the rest of the armory would be up soon from the racket. But no one came down, and I wasn't about to move from the thin comfort of my sleeping bag, which felt like it could shield me as well as an Abrams tank. Not wanting to wake anyone, I whispered, "Bob? John? You guys up?" Bob grumbled back, "I hate you. Is it because you're in a creepy basement or because you heard that too?" "Both." At least I knew I wasn't alone in hearing it. Convinced it was just someone from the unit trying to mess with us, I eventually drifted back to an uneasy sleep. But around 1 a.m., I woke again, feeling tense. Rolling over, I could see the hallway outside our open door, dimly lit by the chemlight. As I watched, I heard slow, deliberate bootsteps echoing down the hall. I hadn't heard anyone come down the stairs, but I fully expected one of the NCOs to come ambling down for a laugh. The steps came closer, steady and slow, and I braced myself, ready to call them out. But then, they passed our door, continuing down the hall without anyone there. I couldn't make sense of it. It wasn't possible. The footsteps reached the end of the hallway, paused, then started back toward us, just as slow, each step clear and deliberate. My pulse raced as I stared at the doorframe, straining to see. Step, 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 it was almost at the door. Step, step, and then it passed by again. I wanted to get up and check, to confirm what I was hearing, but I was frozen, unable to move. Exhausted, I somehow fell back asleep. A few hours later, I woke again to the same footsteps. Step, 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 moving up and down the hallway, never coming into view. By the time dawn broke around 5:30, I'd never been so relieved to get up early. I started packing up with no hesitation, humming just to fill the silence. John gave me a wry look. "So, what do you think?" "There's definitely something weird happening down here." And just as I said it, a piece of cardboard that had been duct-taped over a window tore off, like it had been pulled with force. The night before, it had been put up to block out light for the night vision training, and it had held all night. I tried to laugh it off. "Could have just been the sunrise heating the tape," I said, shrugging. Both my buddies just stared at me. "What?" I muttered. "It's possible." To this day, I still don't know what we experienced in that basement. The banging lockers, the steady footsteps, the cardboard. All of it could maybe be explained away as random events in an old building. But taken together, it's hard not to wonder. I've never really had any terrifying experiences, but looking back, I realize I've had a few strange ones. The first time I ever saw anything unusual was when I was about 10, visiting my grandmother for the summer. I had just stepped out of the shower and spotted a dog in the bathroom with me. It wagged its tail, looking happy to see me, and I remember saying, "Ah, hi, little doggy." I turned away but then stopped, realizing my grandmother didn't own any dogs. I turned back, but it was gone. Since childhood, I'd occasionally feel like someone was gently petting my head when no one was there. But it wasn't until I moved into a duplex in 2009 that things started happening more frequently. The duplex was an old house, and my daughters and I would hear footsteps on the stairs and other strange noises. I brushed it off, blaming it on the age of the house. Every night before bed, we'd double-check the front door, which was right by the stairs, to make sure it was locked. One night, as I was lying in bed, I felt someone sit down beside me. I heard a whisper, "It'll be okay." I felt a deep sense of comfort, almost like I was being reassured. Then, I noticed a figure outside my bedroom door, watching. It seemed to be talking to the presence beside me, saying, "Just a few more minutes, and it'll be okay." I felt so calm that I eventually just closed my eyes and went back to sleep. The next morning, though, I found the front door unlocked, even though nothing was missing. I couldn't figure out what had happened. After that, things kept getting stranger. One time, I was pouring cough medicine for my daughter when something hit my hand, causing the medicine to spill everywhere. Another time, I was alone, and I had placed a snack on the edge of the couch for my baby. Suddenly, it flew across the room, landing a good 5 feet away. It wasn't just a roll. It was as if someone had tossed it. Then one night, my boyfriend and I were in bed, and he suddenly woke me, saying, "Grab the baby." I picked her up, thinking he'd seen a spider or something, but he kept turning the light on and off, looking around. When I asked what was wrong, he told me he'd gone outside for a smoke and, while leaning on the car, saw an evil-looking old lady staring at him from the bedroom window. He said it looked like she was lying between us, just watching him. The really unexplainable events started happening after that. Once, he came upstairs to ask me a question, and we talked for a moment before he walked back down. About 3 seconds later, I saw him again, walking out of my daughter's bedroom, wearing different clothes. He stood at the top of the stairs, looked at me, and gave me this huge, eerie smile before walking down. I sat there, trying to process it, and finally got up to check. My daughters were both sound asleep, and when I went downstairs, he was sitting in his sleep clothes, the same ones he'd been wearing all night. When I mentioned seeing him in his vest, jeans, and hat, he looked at me like I was crazy and insisted he hadn't changed or even left the room until that moment. Another time, I was asleep and woke up to see him standing in the room, staring at me in a way that felt wrong, almost hostile. I closed my eyes, figuring he was just getting ready for bed. But when I looked again, he was still there, staring at me as though he wanted to hurt me. I asked what was wrong, but he didn't answer. He just slowly turned around and went downstairs. I waited about 30 seconds, then followed him down to ask what that was all about, only to find him sound asleep on the couch. When I told him he might have been sleepwalking, he insisted he hadn't moved all night. The most recent incident happened a few weeks ago. My boyfriend got locked up for a couple of days, but I didn't tell my daughters, so they assumed he was just away. I slept on the couch that night, and the next day, my daughter told me she'd heard sounds from the kitchen in the middle of the night. She said she saw him standing there, just watching, as if he'd forgotten something. She figured it was nothing and went back to bed. When I mentioned it to him later on the phone, I knew he hadn't been there. I'm sharing all this because I'm trying to make sense of what's going on. I'm starting to wonder if someone or something is imitating my boyfriend. I never feel a sudden coldness or any eerie chills when it happens, which makes it even harder to explain. It's left me with more questions than answers. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. My wife and I lived in an apartment in the northeast Baltimore suburbs for 7 years, from February 2007 to June 2013. It was the upper floor of a brick duplex built in 1966, a much newer place than our first apartment, a house from 1895 just a mile away. The old place, with its creepy, aged look, seemed like the perfect setting for a ghost story. But despite its age and the creaks and groans, we never had a single odd experience there. So when we moved into the newer, well-kept brick duplex, ghosts were the last thing on our minds. We couldn't have been more wrong. Not long after we moved in, our downstairs neighbor, Carlos, filled us in on some of the apartment's history. A guy named Jimmy Marshall had lived upstairs a couple of years before us and was in some serious trouble with the law, eventually becoming a fugitive and disappearing out of state. Carlos told us Jimmy had lived in the apartment with his parents and brother for years, but after his parents passed away, he was left struggling to make ends meet. Apparently, Jimmy even went so far as to ask his elderly aunt next door to marry him, just so he could inherit her house. She refused, and we all agreed that it was bizarre behavior. But with Jimmy long gone, we laughed it off, thinking that was the end of any strange happenings. We settled into our apartment, but one summer night, my wife and I were sitting in the living room watching TV when something caught my eye. I glanced left and saw an odd, oval-shaped mass floating down the hallway. It was about the size and shape of a football but more rounded, like a swirling mass of dark gray smoke. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't quite smoke, but it wasn't solid either. It looked almost like a ball of steel wool, with strands twisting and curling around each other, moving slowly towards the open kitchen doorway. As it reached the door, it just vanished. It lasted only a few seconds, but I was completely unnerved. My wife hadn't seen it, she was half asleep, and though I tried to shake it off, the memory lingered. Curious and a little shaken, I wondered if it could have been a ghost. On a day off, I left a tape recorder in different rooms, just to see if I'd capture anything unusual. When I played back the recordings, most of the sounds seemed ordinary, but one in the spare bedroom stood out. A strange PFFFF sound, like something tapping the microphone twice. I tried to recreate it by tapping the microphone myself, and it was an exact match. The only logical explanation I could think of was that maybe an insect had bumped into it, but I wasn't fully convinced. A month later, I got up late one night to grab a snack from the kitchen. I'd done this 1,000 times, but as I walked in, I suddenly froze. A strange, overwhelming feeling of panic washed over me. It was August and the apartment was humid. Our only AC unit was in the bedroom, yet all the hairs on my neck stood up. I felt an intense presence behind me, like someone was watching. I looked back, expecting to see my wife, but no one was there. My heart was racing as I turned toward the refrigerator. Though I couldn't see anyone, I felt certain that someone was there, staring right at me. Terrified, I bolted back to bed. My wife woke up as I climbed in and touched my arm, commenting that I was cold and had goosebumps. It was the first time I'd felt that kind of fear in the dark since I was a kid. Things continued to escalate. A few months later, in November, we were both in the kitchen after work, preparing dinner. I was focused on the microwave when my wife suddenly jumped back with a scream. She said that a metal spoon on the counter had moved by itself, sliding in a half circle across the counter, as though someone had nudged it with their hand. I didn't see it, but I heard the sound of it scraping the counter, and there was no way she could have moved it herself, as both of her hands were up in the cabinet. We stood there in silence, looking at each other, wondering what was going on. It wasn't until the following spring that we got any answers. In May or June 2008, our downstairs neighbor, Rick, was moving out and offered us his TV, which he didn't want to lug with him. I declined, but we sat down to share a beer, and he started talking about the neighborhood. As we were chatting, he mentioned something that made my stomach drop. I don't want you guys thinking there's anything spooky going on, but I thought you should know. An old lady died in your apartment. Mrs. Marshall, that was her name, he said, his voice low. They found her in the kitchen, lying on the floor. She'd collapsed at the table, maybe while having coffee, and just bled out, right there. A real bad mess, from what I heard. Suddenly, the feeling of being watched in that kitchen, the strange smoky mass in the hallway, and the spoon sliding across the counter. All of it clicked into place. We'd been feeling her presence all along. When my wife and I first moved into our apartment in Northeast Baltimore in 2007, we thought we'd left any thoughts of haunted houses behind. We'd come from an older place, a house built in 1895, which, with its worn exterior and creaky floors, felt like it should have been haunted. But in all our time there, nothing strange ever happened. So moving into this solid, newer brick duplex built in 1966, the idea of ghosts didn't even cross our minds. Shortly after we moved in, our downstairs neighbor, Carlos, filled us in on the apartment's past. He told us that the previous tenant upstairs, a man named Jimmy Marshall, had run into serious trouble with the law before disappearing out of state. Apparently, Jimmy had lived in our unit with his parents for years, scraping by financially. After his parents passed, things took a desperate turn, with Jimmy even proposing marriage to his elderly aunt next door, hoping to inherit her house. She saw through his intentions and the plan fell through. We brushed it off as bizarre history, relieved that we'd never have to worry about Jimmy returning. But soon, strange things started happening. One summer night, my wife and I were relaxing in the living room when something out of the corner of my eye caught my attention. I turned and saw a small, oval-shaped mass, gray and smoky, drifting down the hallway toward the kitchen. It wasn't quite smoke, but not a solid object either. It reminded me of a ball of steel wool, with strands swirling and shifting as it floated. I watched, frozen, as it reached the kitchen doorway and simply vanished. My wife, half asleep, hadn't noticed it, but the sight shook me deeply. I started to wonder if we were sharing the apartment with more than just memories. A few days later, curious and unsettled, I decided to leave a tape recorder in various rooms to see if anything unusual might happen when we weren't around. For the most part, the recordings sounded ordinary, except for one from the spare bedroom. On playback, I heard an odd PFFFF, PFFFF noise, like something had tapped the microphone twice. I tried replicating the sound and realized that it was identical to the noise the mic made if I tapped it directly. The only logical guess I could muster was that an insect had bumped into it. But as time went on, this theory seemed less and less likely. A few months later, in August, I got up one night to grab a snack from the kitchen. I was used to these late-night snack runs, but this time was different. The moment I walked into the kitchen, I was seized by a strange sense of panic. All the hairs on my neck stood up, and I felt sure that someone was standing right behind me, watching. I turned to check, hoping to see my wife, but there was no one there. My heart raced as I looked around, yet I felt an overwhelming presence in the kitchen with me. I quickly grabbed my snack and rushed back to bed, shaken to the core. When I climbed in, my wife woke up, noticing that I was cold and covered in goosebumps. It was the first time in years that I'd felt truly afraid in the dark. A few months later, in November, we were both in the kitchen preparing dinner when something happened that neither of us could explain. My wife let out a sudden scream, and when I asked what was wrong, she said she'd seen a metal spoon on the counter move by itself, sliding in a half circle, as if someone had pushed it. She hadn't touched it. Her hands were up in the cabinet above. Though I didn't see it move, I heard the metallic scrape across the counter, and we both stood there, unnerved. We tried to brush these incidents off, hoping things would settle down. By spring of 2008, we hadn't had any new occurrences, and we'd almost convinced ourselves it was all in our heads. Then, one evening, our neighbor Rick, who was moving out, invited me for a beer and started chatting about the apartment. Casually, he dropped a bombshell. "I don't want to freak you out," he began, "but I thought you should know. An old lady died in your apartment a few years back, Mrs. Marshall. They found her lying in the kitchen, right by the table. Real bad scene. They say she was just sitting there, having her morning coffee, when she collapsed. Bled out all over the floor. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The kitchen, that same kitchen where I'd felt someone watching, where my wife had seen the spoon move, and where I'd seen that smoky shape floating. I went upstairs to tell my wife, and her eyes widened in shock. She turned toward the kitchen and said aloud, "We don't wish you any harm. We're nice people, and we don't mind if you're here. Just please don't frighten us. Talking to an empty room felt strange, but we both felt we needed to acknowledge what might be happening. That fall, things started up again. One night, as we sat watching a movie, we both saw a sudden flash of light in the hallway, near the kitchen doorway. It was in the exact spot where I'd seen the grayish figure months before. There was no sound, and it was gone as quickly as it appeared. We wondered if it could be static electricity, given the dry, colder weather, but we couldn't find any reasonable explanation. A year later, in the fall of 2009, I was in the living room late at night trying to finish a book for a class. It was after 2 a.m. and I was exhausted. As I read, I felt a growing sense of unease, like someone was watching me from the kitchen. Ignoring it at first, I kept reading, but the feeling grew stronger. Finally, I looked up, and there, in the dim kitchen, I could make out the shadowy figure of a man, standing and smiling at me. He looked like an older man, and it seemed as though he was leaning on something. I sat frozen, unable to speak or move. Silently, I willed him to leave, thinking to myself, I hope you can move on. I'm just trying to get to bed. Without looking back, I shuffled to the bedroom, hoping I was just overly tired. I didn't even mention it to my wife for days. After that, my wife invited her childhood friend over, and was known for her psychic sensitivity, and although she hadn't been to our place before, she agreed to come by and see if she felt anything. Coming up the stairs, she said she felt residual energy, especially from young people who may have lived there before us. But when she reached the spare bedroom, she paused. She said she felt something lingering there but couldn't define it. In the living room, she looked at my bottle collection and remarked that someone was probably moving them to get my attention. She suggested it could be an older woman who had a fondness for collecting things herself. When Anne reached the kitchen, she seemed particularly drawn to the area. She described seeing an older man there and even sketched a rough picture of him, noting his friendly smile. She also felt what she called an energy vortex in front of the refrigerator. She explained that it might be an opening where energy could come and go, connecting us to spirits from other places. Over the next few years, other things happened. Light bulbs flickering in the kitchen only when I was present, faint footsteps, and even a night when my wife screamed in terror when I came to bed, momentarily not recognizing me as though I were a stranger. One evening, in late 2011, while cleaning, I felt compelled to look out the kitchen window. I glanced up and saw an old woman's face reflected in the glass, with gray hair curled around green-colored rollers. When I looked away and back, it was gone. The final straw came in early 2012. My wife was pregnant, and we started hearing sniffles and footsteps when I wasn't home. After our son was born, she felt a presence gently tapping her on the head as she fed him, as though approving of her new role as a mother. It felt oddly comforting, as if Mrs. Marshall was quietly watching over us. By the spring of 2013, we decided it was time to move, sensing that this was Mrs. Marshall's place more than ours. From August 16th to the 18th, my mom, her boyfriend, my little brother, and I took a trip to Ocean City, Maryland. Everything was wonderful except for our motel, the Islander. The room itself had an unsettling vibe, and as soon as we walked in, I couldn't help but feel that something was off. The room was arranged with 2 beds, one by the door and window, and the other, my bed, right in front of the bathroom. Late that night, after I'd finally logged off my computer, I decided to get some sleep. Everyone else was already out cold, and we had an early morning planned, so I turned off the light and crawled into bed. Right away, I felt an uneasy sense that I was being watched. The curtains were shut, and the others were fast asleep, so I tried to brush it off. But the faint green glow from the air conditioner cast just enough light across the room that I could see my bed, the bathroom, and even the bathroom mirror in front of me. For some reason, I couldn't stop staring into the bathroom, as if I might see something moving in there. As I lay there, trying to fall asleep, my eyes kept drifting to the mirror. That's when I saw it. A faint, shadowy figure in the reflection. It looked like someone standing close to the mirror, watching me from within it. I was lying down, and the mirror was too high for it to be my own reflection. My heart pounded as I realized this couldn't be a trick of the light. Frozen with fear, I couldn't bring myself to get up and shut the door. Instead, I scooted closer to my little brother, pulled the blankets over me, and forced myself to sleep. The next night, I made sure to keep the bathroom door closed. I still felt that eerie sensation of being watched, but it wasn't as overwhelming without the figure visible in the mirror. The next morning, my mom started snapping photos around the room. As she reviewed them, she noticed a strange white haze over some of the images. She laughed, saying, "I think our room is haunted. Look at all these orbs." Her comment made my skin crawl. I thought maybe I was just overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Finally, we returned home to Pennsylvania, and I was relieved to be back in my own space. But that first night home, the feeling came back. I had that same unsettling sense that someone was watching me. I immediately looked over to the large mirror by my doorway. Nothing. Then I glanced at my flat-screen TV directly in front of my bed. The screen itself doesn't reflect much, but the frame around it is highly reflective. When I looked at the screen, I saw nothing unusual, but when I raised my gaze to the frame, my heart nearly stopped. Staring back at me was a gray face with hollow, dark eye sockets. I jumped and looked away, but the image was burned into my mind. I dared to look back only to find it still there, watching. The lights were on, so I could see every detail of that chilling face. I tried moving around, thinking it might be a warped reflection of myself, but it didn't change. Desperately, I scanned the room, hoping to find something that could explain the face, but nothing matched what I was seeing. For the rest of the night, I was gripped by fear. Every time I looked, the face was still there, unchanging, as if it were staring back at me from another place entirely. The next morning, I checked again, half expecting it to be gone. But there it was. Later that day, though, when I went to look, the face was gone, like it had never been there at all. I tried to move past it, thinking maybe I'd finally figured it out, but that night, as much as I dreaded it, I looked again. Still nothing. What scared me most was the way the reflection had appeared and then disappeared, despite nothing in my room having changed. I can't help but wonder if something from that creepy motel decided to come home with me, lingering and watching. Now, I can't sleep without covering up the TV, just in case. When I was 15, we had a cat named Elliot. He'd been with us nearly my entire life, probably around 12 or 13 years old by then. We called him King Elliot because he ruled our neighborhood. No one ever had to worry about rats while he was around. He disappeared a few times over the years, giving us a few scares, but he always made his way home. He was a constant presence. Not a particularly affectionate cat, but undeniably family. One day, though, Elliot came home and just lay down on the couch, refusing to get up. It was obvious he wasn't well. We took him to the vet right away, and I remember the vet telling us, very gently but directly, that Elliot had advanced cancer. There was nothing that could be done. He was suffering, and it was time to say goodbye. Though I felt the sadness of it, it was my mom who was heartbroken. She held him so tightly the vet had to gently ask her to set him down for the medication to work. It was a difficult moment, and afterward, we went home and buried him in our backyard. We spent the day reminiscing about how tough he'd been, how we never realized he was even sick. The next morning, my mom and I got up early and started making coffee. It was a beautiful summer day, with sunlight streaming through the curtains. I got up to open them wider to let in more light and get a view of the front porch. But when I did, I gasped. Sitting on the front porch, bathed in the morning light, was a beautiful gray cat that looked exactly like Elliot. Only it was Elliot as he'd been in his prime. Healthy, strong, and full of life. I called to my mom. "Mom, Elliot's on the front porch." She nearly dropped her coffee, hurrying over in shock. We looked at each other, then ran outside, half dazed. The cat didn't disappear or shy away. It sat there waiting for us, letting us pet it and even feeding it, responding just as Elliot would have in that calm, familiar way. Of course, we knew it wasn't really him, but the resemblance was so uncanny that we couldn't help but wonder. For the next 2 mornings, the cat returned, sitting in the same spot as if he were waiting to greet us. But after that, it never came back. My mom and I would sometimes talk about it, wondering what became of that cat, and part of us couldn't help but think that Elliot had somehow sent a kindred spirit, a messenger, to let us know he was okay. It was the strangest experience I've ever had, and to this day, I haven't had another one like it. But whatever that cat's reason was for stopping by, I'm glad it did. It brought us both an unexpected comfort, a quiet reassurance that Elliot was at peace. I've often heard kids talking about something scary in their closet, but for me it wasn't just a story. My experience was real. My grandparents were a big part of my life, especially when I was young, because they lived close by. Even though it's been 4 years since they both passed, in the same year, memories of them are still vivid. One particular memory stands out from when I was about 5. My grandmother was at our house that day, and I'd been told to hurry up and clean my room. With my young logic, I decided the easiest solution was to shove all my toys into the closet. I thought it was pretty clever, almost as if I could imagine myself twirling an imaginary handlebar mustache with pride. When my grandmother came in, she was amazed at how quickly I'd cleaned my room. But as soon as she opened the closet, my plan collapsed as all the toys tumbled out. I ended up helping her clean up the mess, and after that, I never tried the hide it in the closet trick again. My grandparents lived in a small, cozy house on the outskirts of the BWI airport. Walking into their home always felt warm and welcoming. My grandfather would greet me with a "Hey there, bud," and my grandmother would call from the kitchen, "Hey, Han, we're in here. Come on in." They were down-to-earth, friendly people who made everyone feel welcome. Their home was simple but full of little details I remember clearly. The house had a split foyer, so you'd go up a short flight of stairs to get to the main floor. To the left was a family room where we'd set up the Christmas tree and hunt for Easter eggs every year. It was a space for special occasions. Straight ahead was a small kitchen, and next to it was the living room, which was filled with family photos and simple furniture. A 3-seater couch, a rocking chair, and a little footstool. My grandfather would sit at the end of the dining table, usually with a different plastic table cover, either flipping through the yellow pages, playing with a calculator, or studying maps. Now, off to the right from the stairs, there was a long hallway leading to the bedrooms. At the end of that hallway, you could go either left to my grandmother's room or right to the spare room. This spare room had another small room inside it, which we called the storage room, and in that storage room was a closet. The storage room was dark and honestly gave me the creeps. I wasn't a fan of the dark as a kid, and that room always had an eerie, unsettling vibe, especially the closet. Even today, I still prefer to sleep with a light on. Fast forward to about 2 years after my grandparents passed. One night, I was getting ready for bed and turned on my closet light out of habit. For months, the closet light had been burnt out, and yet that night it suddenly worked. Surprised, I ran downstairs to ask my parents, "Did one of you change my light bulbs?" But both said they hadn't touched it. That left me with a chill, especially since my mom was still coping with their passing around that time. One thing I remember about my grandfather is that he loved a good laugh, often at our expense. He'd even hide in the hallway bathroom to jump out and scare us as we walked by. I couldn't help but think, could he be trying to reach out to me? Since then, we've had a few other strange contacts that seemed connected to my grandparents. Once, my sister got a random race number that matched their old house address exactly. I've also started noticing what some people call shadow people. Shadows moving at the edges of my vision. As I write this, I even see faint shadows flickering around me. Part of me wants to believe these shadows are my grandparents, still watching over me. But honestly, I have no idea what it really is. I'm no ghost hunter. My parents bought the house I live in back in the early 90s, around 1994, when I was about 7. It's a large home with 6 bedrooms and 3 floors. A basement, main level, and an upper level with the bedrooms and bathrooms. The house was built by a contracting company under my dad's supervision, and it's been our family home ever since. But from the first day we moved in, I remember feeling a strange nervousness, especially when I was alone in my room or going down the stairs. It often felt like something was watching me, especially from the top of the staircase. After a couple of months, things started getting a bit more intense. One night, the shade on my bedroom window snapped up all on its own. I'd hear the floors and stairs creaking at odd times, like someone was walking around in the hallway. Every night, I'd feel my bed shake gently, as if someone was standing at the foot of it, giving it a little push. My sister had similar experiences. She would sometimes feel knocking on the bottom of her bed that would only stop if she asked. One Christmas, there was a strange knocking sound on the walls in the living room. My sister and I started knocking on other walls, and it was as if the sound followed us, moving from wall to wall. My parents, concerned, called an exterminator, thinking there were mice in the walls, but nothing was ever found. As we got older, the strange activities seemed to fade away, and I mostly forgot about them or brushed them off as imagination. I moved out after high school and lived in a few apartments during college and after, but nothing unusual ever happened in those places. A year and a half ago, though, I moved back home to finish school, and it feels like some of the old activity might be starting up again. The house is as noisy as ever, with floorboards creaking upstairs, sometimes loudly enough at night to wake me up. My dog, who used to sleep in my bed with me at my apartment, now won't even come into my room and often stares at the ceiling, as if watching something I can't see. Other strange things happen too. Random small objects sometimes appear on the floor, things I don't remember owning or haven't seen in years. The other day, I was in the shower and heard something fall. When I got out, I found one of my sister's rings in the middle of the bathroom floor. My cat sometimes knocks things over, but she wasn't in the bathroom, and my sister's room has been closed since she moved to Australia in 2011. Her jewelry box hasn't been touched in years. My fiancé also feels uneasy in the house. He actually rents a nearby apartment instead of staying here with me because he says he always feels like he's being watched. Strange things also seem to happen more when he's around. One night he was staying over, and after we'd gone to bed, the hallway light came on by itself. He got up, turned it off, and closed the door on his way back to bed. But a few minutes later, the door opened a few inches on its own. He hasn't stayed another night here since. The house sits on a piece of land my parents have used as a small hobby farm. We have a large vegetable garden, a barn, some chickens, a mule, and a couple of goats. When we first started digging for the vegetable garden, we found an old horseshoe. My mom cleaned it as best she could, though it was very rusty, and I've kept it hanging above my bedroom door for the last 16 years. Maybe that's somehow connected to these strange occurrences. Though the activity has always been mild and nothing threatening has ever happened, it's still unsettling. My boyfriend has been living in the same apartment with two friends for about 6 years in Gaithersburg, Maryland, in a 1960s-style, 3-floor apartment building. Over the years, as we've been dating, I've heard them joke about the other tenant in the apartment. They all claim to have heard footsteps in the hallway or seen lights turn on when no one else was home. Even I have had moments where I'd hear the door open and close or hear footsteps, only to find myself alone in the apartment. Sometimes, I get that strange feeling like I'm not actually alone, even when I know no one else is around. 2 weeks ago, my boyfriend decided to paint his bedroom. After we moved his bed, dresser, and a few boxes back into the room, I decided to stay over since it was so late. That night, I kept waking up with an eerie feeling that I was being watched. I woke up like that at least 4 times. That was Wednesday night. On Friday, I stayed over again. My boyfriend and I decided to stay in for dinner and a movie while his roommates went out. After dinner, we cleaned up, set the dishwasher, and started heading to the bedroom. On the way, we paused to look at a funny note someone had left on a whiteboard on his roommate's bedroom door. I was just about to make a joke about it when suddenly, the door opened by itself. Not fast or in a creepy way, but slowly and smoothly, almost like it was inviting us in. We both froze, just staring. My mouth dropped open, and I looked at my boyfriend in shock. At first, I thought maybe someone was playing a joke on us, so I looked behind the door, but no one was there. My boyfriend just laughed and said, "Looks like they like you. They're inviting you in." I laughed nervously and replied, "Oh, okay. Well, thanks, but no thanks," and closed the door. Later that same night, after the movie ended, we went to my car to grab my backpack with my overnight stuff. I glanced over at the roommate's door before we left, and it was closed, just like I had left it earlier. But when we came back, the door was open again. My boyfriend tried to find a rational explanation, suggesting I hadn't closed it properly, or maybe a gust of air had moved it while we were out. I told him I'd be open to that idea, but the apartment has carpet, and the bottom of the door drags on it, making it nearly impossible for air to push it open. And, I reminded him, there was no breeze when it opened right in front of us earlier. I've stayed over a few times since then, and while I still get the odd feeling of being watched, I haven't witnessed any more strange activity. My boyfriend seems to think it's a friendly ghost, saying that its welcome gesture was warm and inviting, not creepy. I've seen strange things before, but this experience left me speechless because it was so obvious and deliberate. The disturbances in my house had been getting worse, reaching a point where I could no longer bear staying there, so I decided to temporarily move out. Oddly, my mood started to worsen at the new place too. I would sink into sadness, feel anxious for no reason, or become suddenly angry, emotions that aren't typical for me. I usually try to stay optimistic and balanced, but the longer I stayed in that house, the harder it was to keep that up. Once I left, the feelings would vanish, but returning home filled me with dread. I've always been aware of a spiritual presence in my home, ever since I was a child. But in recent years, it's been affecting me so much that it's interfering with my life. Desperate, I reached out to a friend for advice. She offered to read the house, even though she was located in a different state. As she began to describe what she was sensing, it was like she was reading my mind. Without knowing any of my personal experiences, she described nearly everything I'd felt in the house. She mentioned sensing a man's presence and described him exactly as I had seen him. Tall, with a large build and a powerful presence. She described him as rude, the nice way to put it. This was the same figure I had seen many times, walking up and down the hallway and around the master bedroom, sometimes stopping just outside my door. I once even woke up to find him standing at the foot of my bed, glaring at me with such hatred that it was terrifying. She then described another presence, a heavy-set woman with a mean personality, and she mentioned a dead relative I hadn't told anyone about. He passed when I was just a toddler, but she explained that he was attached to me because of similar feelings we shared during a period of depression in my life. Her accuracy convinced me of her ability, and I eventually reached out to another friend to confirm. Amazingly, she picked up on the same entities describing the same figures and energies. She even told me she could see me as a child during my very first ghostly encounter, which happened when I was about 8 or 9. Then, my friend sensed something even more disturbing. She said she was picking up on another person tied to the house, someone whose intense emotions had created a portal, allowing others to come through. This person, she said, was a young man who was deeply hurt, lonely, and angry, a tormented soul. Then she added, he was hanged. He was hanged in your house. I was immediately creeped out, but took it with a grain of salt, until I told my mother what my friend had said. My mom looked at me, wide-eyed, and replied, a few years ago, I had a dream where a little boy came to me and said, they hanged me. We just stared at each other, chills running down my spine. Shortly after, I walked into the kitchen and felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion, almost as if a heavy weight was pressing on my chest. I was overcome with grief and burst into tears, feeling a deep sadness for this boy and what he'd gone through. It became too intense to bear, so I left the kitchen, and as soon as I did, the feelings subsided. Later, I returned to the kitchen and addressed the spirit, telling him I knew what had happened to him and that it was awful and unfair. I encouraged him to find peace and move towards the light. While I don't think he's fully crossed over, his presence has felt lighter and less oppressive since that day. He now spends more time in my room and nearby areas, whereas he used to stay mostly in the basement, where we believe he was hanged. The loneliness he must have felt seemed to make him restless, and now that he knows we're aware of him, he seems a bit more at peace. Since that day, the house feels less heavy, and I can move around without constantly looking over my shoulder or battling mood swings, though I still feel his presence. There are still strange sounds, though. Sometimes I overhear arguments and heart-wrenching cries in certain rooms. While in the bathroom, I've occasionally heard a heated argument. And while in my bedroom, I've heard desperate cries like, no, no, oh my God, no. It sounds like disbelief, almost as if someone had walked in and witnessed something terrible. If I leave the room, the sounds stop. Thinking back to childhood experiences in this house, I realize now that he may have been trying to communicate for years. As a kid, I remember hearing sounds like someone pounding and breaking through concrete, especially through the master bedroom vents, which are directly above where we believe he was murdered. My grandmother even told my father she used to hear sounds of carpet being laid down on the stairs. I suspect something violent might have happened here, and that the carpet was replaced to cover up the evidence. Part of me wants to help him cross over, but I'm also afraid of opening myself up to the other spirits here. One of my friends believes the energy here is so dark that the house should be torn down. She thinks many terrible things have happened here and that several spirits are stuck, either unable or unwilling to move on. When I open myself up to these presences, I sometimes see things. Recently, I tried focusing, and I began seeing things from a strange perspective, almost like my head was on the floor, my ear pressed to the carpet fibers, rocking slightly. This vision kept repeating, as if I were watching from someone else's point of view, ending with my sight drifting down through the floor and into the ground. Right now, I feel that there's someone in the very center of the room. It appears to be a young boy, maybe 5 feet 7 inches or 5 feet 9 inches, standing quietly. I can't see details, just a dark mist. He seems confused, as though he doesn't know why he's there. His energy feels so similar to that of my late cousin. It's as if he's drawn to the energy of the boy who was hanged. I'm torn between wanting to help him move on and fearing the risk of bringing other spirits closer. But after everything I've learned, I believe he's been reaching out, hoping someone would understand and finally give him the peace he deserves. Like many of you, I grew up in a Victorian-era house, which, like many old homes, came with its own resident spirit. My dad was a big non-believer and brushed off any talk of the lady that supposedly haunted our home. I didn't even know about this until I was 14, on a night when the attic light was on. It was Christmas time, 1974. My brother had just finished boot camp and was coming home for the holidays. We were all excited to see him and hear his stories. My dad, thrilled his son was coming home, borrowed a friend's new mobile home to pick him up from the airport. Maybe it was to show off a little, but he seemed genuinely happy to have his boy back. So it was my dad, my stepmom, my little brother who was 12, and me. My sister had to work late, so she couldn't come. My brother's flight came in around 10 p.m., so we didn't get home until about 11:30. My dad dropped us off and said he'd take the RV back to his friend. As he drove off, mentioning something about getting a loaf of bread, we noticed something strange. My stepmom looked up at the front of the house and saw that the attic light was on. Thinking my sister had gone up there for wrapping supplies and forgotten to turn it off, she sent me upstairs to remind her. I went to our room, which was completely dark. Surprised, I gently woke my sister, saying, "Mom wants you to turn off the attic light. You left it on." What she said next chilled me to the bone. I never went up there. I came straight to bed when I got home. My heart stopped as I made my way to the attic stairs, pausing by the door. I could hear footsteps walking around up there. Terrified, I raced down the stairs 3 at a time. When I got to the kitchen, my stepmom and brothers said I looked pale as a ghost. Barely able to speak, I finally managed to say, "She never went up there." And we all exchanged looks of real fear. At that point, I was ready to leave the house. But no, my brother, feeling brave after finishing boot camp, decided we should go check it out. So we headed back upstairs, standing in the hall and listening. Sure enough, we could all hear the footsteps, clear and distinct, like someone walking in heels, not flat shoes. The footsteps moved across the attic, and then, to our horror, started coming down the stairs. Halfway down the attic stairs was a single bare light bulb with a chain hanging down from it. That was the only light in the attic. As the footsteps descended, we heard the chain being pulled and saw the light go off from under the attic door. Then, silence. The footsteps stopped, and there was no sound. I looked over to see my older brother clutching our dad's double-barrel shotgun, which he kept under the bed for emergencies. Standing in the dark, terrified, we heard the front door open. My dad walked in, calling out, "Where's everybody?" He came upstairs, flipping on lights as he went, and found us huddled in the hallway, our eyes wide with fear. When he saw my brother holding the shotgun, he was completely baffled. Still holding the loaf of bread he'd picked up, he handed it to me, yanked open the attic door, and went up. My dad was 6 feet 4 inches, raised in an orphanage and fearless, so we were half expecting him to find someone up there. We listened to him walking around, and soon enough he came back down, frustrated and shaking his head. "There's nobody up there," he said, looking at us like we were out of our minds. I never experienced anything in the attic after that, but that house was definitely haunted. I live on an old farm that's been in my family for over 100 years. The original house on the property is still standing, and I call it the creepy old house. Mostly because, well, it's both creepy and old. Over the past year or so, my friends and I have had some strange experiences there. The first time something happened, I was with my friend Elle. We kept hearing footsteps coming from the top floor, which definitely freaked us out. The house has 2 floors with 2 rooms on each, and while it used to have a fireplace, now there's just a hole where it once was. That hole is usually how my friends and I get inside. The most recent experience happened with my other friend, B. We'd been at the house about a month before and heard noises and footsteps, but this time B wanted to go up the stairs alone while I waited in the fireplace hole. She moved up the stairs slowly, reaching only the 2nd step when I thought I heard whispering. Unsure, I listened closely before asking B if she heard it too. At first, she said no, but then she stopped, listened, and eventually heard it as well, though the whispers soon faded away completely. At that point, I wanted to leave, but B insisted on going up to the 2nd floor. As she made her way up, she kept hearing different sounds. Finally, she reached the top, and I watched her, but then she suddenly turned and ran back down. I asked her what happened, but all she said was, "Run." So we both ran and didn't stop until we were back on the main path, about 200 yards from the house. B then told me she'd heard a lot of movement upstairs, which had scared her enough to make her dash out. Relieved to be away from the house, we suddenly realized the cat that had followed us over was still inside. I didn't want the cat to get lost, so I suggested we go back. B offered to go alone while I waited on the main path, but I didn't want to leave her to go back alone. She insisted, so I stayed back, only moving closer once she'd gone a few yards ahead. The cat eventually came out, but B still wanted to go back inside the house by herself. I reached the front of the house about a minute after she'd gone in. Suddenly, I heard a voice, a little girl's voice, calling out what sounded like my name, sounding scared. Panicked, I called out B's name and moved toward the side of the house to enter. But then B stepped out, smiling. All she said was, "Children." Before asking what she meant, I asked if she'd called me. She said she hadn't said a word, but she had heard a voice. I asked, "Did it sound like a scared little girl?" She nodded. I told her I thought it had called my name, but she disagreed, so we never figured out exactly what the voice had said. B told me she thought the voice came from outside, while I felt like it was coming from inside. We decided to head home, and as we left, I kept looking back at the house. Just then, I saw a flash of light move across the right window from left to right. I mentioned this to B, and she reminded me that the last time we'd been there, she'd seen the same flash in the same window, only moving in the opposite direction. As I write this, I remember another strange sight from 2 years earlier. After Elle and I had visited the house, I was passing by when I saw what looked like a pure white leaf falling past the left window. I still don't know what that was. Here's another strange detail. Both times B and I visited the creepy old house were on the 11th of February and the 11th of April. Weird enough for you? I've always been interested in the paranormal, though I hadn't made up my mind about it until June 2005. I live in Baltimore, Maryland, with my 3 children, Michael, Alea, and Taylor. After my relationship with their father ended, I moved in with my mom to get back on my feet, which took about 2 years. I couldn't wait for the day I'd have my own place again, so I was thrilled when I was approved for a row house on Bentaloo Street. If you've seen The Wire on HBO, you know the style of Baltimore row houses, though mine was a bit nicer. 2 months after moving in, I started to feel like I wasn't alone in the house. I hadn't seen anything, so I pushed the thought aside. But on a couple of occasions, I asked my brother John if he'd noticed anything strange. He admitted he'd felt it too, especially in the kitchen, bathroom, and basement when he was doing laundry. He finally told me that, a week after we moved in, he thought he'd seen and heard something but didn't want to scare me or the kids. He described one Saturday morning when we were all still asleep. He was in the shower and the bathroom door opened. John saw a figure of a man walk by and head towards the toilet. He called out, but the figure didn't respond, only walked back out of the bathroom. John wasn't too freaked out since he assumed it was my boyfriend, Man, who might have been embarrassed. Later, he asked me if Man had spent the night, but I told him no and we left it at that. Since then, he hadn't seen anything, but he never felt comfortable in the bathroom again. By September, I was getting the kids ready for bed on a school night, following our usual evening schedule. My children shared a walk-through bedroom, meaning you had to pass through their room to get to mine. I didn't mind since I liked having them close. I was ironing clothes in my room when I heard my daughter's toy princess stove chime, "We're ready to cook," followed by the sound of something on the burner. I called into the kids' room, telling them to get back to bed and leave the toys alone. When I asked firmly, "Do you understand me?" they all chimed in with a sleepy, "Yes." After ironing, I got into bed and looked for something to watch to fall asleep to. I can only sleep if there's something on the TV. A few minutes later, I heard the toy stove again. I called out the same way and got up to check on them. Opening the door, I realized they were all sound asleep. I even tickled them to see if they were faking it, but they were genuinely annoyed that I woke them up. Convinced it was just the batteries, I took them out, and the toy didn't go off again that night. Over the next few weeks, though, the stove kept turning on by itself. One night, I heard it again and yelled for the kids to go to sleep. This time, my daughter Alea shouted back, "Ma, it's not us. He keeps messing with it." I assumed she meant her brother Michael, so I told him to leave his sister's toy alone. Alea then said, "Not him. Mikey's asleep." I went into their room, asking what she meant. She sat up in bed and said, "The little boy, Ma. I don't know who he is, but he keeps messing with our stuff." Talk about goosebumps. I had her come into my room, then brought Taylor and Mikey in too, deciding they would all sleep in my bed that night. I asked Alea why she hadn't told me about the little boy before. She said she wasn't scared of him or the man in the red shirt, who she described as telling her to go back to sleep when she'd wake up at night. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but she seemed so calm and sincere. She wasn't even stuttering, like she usually does when she's making things up. I couldn't imagine being 7 years old and not being scared by strangers appearing in my room. The kids stayed in my room for a few weeks, but the toy stove continued to go off randomly, confirming my belief in what Alea had told me. Along with this, I often felt like I was being watched. Then, one night, John screamed like I'd never heard before, making me think he was in real danger. I pounded on his door, desperate to get in. He finally flung it open, bolted down the stairs, and shouted, "I'm getting the bleep out of here." I ran after him, asking what happened. John, visibly shaken, explained that he was getting ready for bed, listening to Maxwell, his go-to when he's feeling romantic, LOL. Near the end of the song, he said he started hearing other voices, evil-sounding, mixing with Maxwell's voice. He opened his eyes, and there were 3 short, faceless dark figures in front of him. He was paralyzed at first, unable to scream or move. When I asked if he might have been dreaming, he got mad, swearing he'd just laid down and wasn't even sleepy yet. I could tell by his tone that he was serious. I asked when he finally screamed, and he said, "When the little bleeps disappeared." For a while after that, the kids continued seeing the man in the red shirt and the little boy, and John's new girlfriend started staying over more often. For me, it was mainly the toy stove going off and feeling watched until one morning. I had just sent the kids off to school and was home alone, getting ready for a late shift. I came out of my room and nearly tripped over Michael's remote control car. Annoyed, I muttered to myself, "How hard is it to keep that bleeping thing under the bed? I'm tossing it out if I find it on the floor again." I went to the bathroom, still grumbling. Suddenly, The car took off on its own and parked itself under the bed. Couldn't believe it. I bolted outside just as my sister was coming back from dropping off her kids. Thankfully, I stayed at her place until it was time for work. Another experience happened one night when I had friends over for cards. My youngest daughter, Taylor, kept coming downstairs, hoping for a little cash. After charming a few dollars from us, she went back to bed. As we finished our game, I heard Taylor call out, "Mommy." I asked what she wanted, but she didn't respond. After hearing it 2 more times, I went upstairs to check and found her fast asleep. I even tried tickling her to see if she was faking, but she was genuinely out. Everyone had heard her voice, but it wasn't Taylor calling. Another time, I was fixing the girls' bunk bed, which had broken. As I worked, I suddenly heard a child's voice say, "Mommy?" right in my ear. I jumped up and ran into my room, though I knew the kids hadn't snuck past me. They were all downstairs playing, and none of them had called me. My final experience came while doing laundry late one Friday night. John was annoyed, as he usually did laundry then, so I offered to throw a load in for him. Feeling watched, I headed upstairs but realized I'd forgotten my load in the dryer. I asked John to grab it, making an excuse, but he just gave me his usual no, so, reluctantly, I went back down. As I turned to go up the stairs with the laundry basket, I saw a floating black figure by the washer. I dropped everything and ran up both flights of stairs, bursting into John's room in tears. After more strange events in the row house on Bentaloo Street, I finally saved enough to move, though the experiences didn't end there. We later looked into the house's history. We never found any reason for the little boy's presence, but neighbors told us that a man had died in the basement from an overdose. Oddly, they also remembered that he often wore a red shirt and had a bad odor, though my daughter never mentioned a smell. Between 2003 and 2005, I worked at a boarding and grooming kennel in Crownsville, Maryland. The property had 2 buildings, the grooming shop, which was next to the parking area, and the kennel building behind it. The entire area, including the dog runs and play yards, was enclosed by a 6-foot privacy fence. When I first started working there, I noticed some odd things. Occasionally, I'd see a shadow flicker across the glass door, but no one would come in. Sometimes the gate latch on the side of the building would rattle, but no one would be there. Other workers mentioned feeling like they were never truly alone in the kennel. Though with 50-plus dogs around, I brushed it off. One morning, as I arrived for my shift, I found 2 coworkers sitting by the gate, smoking before their shift started. Suddenly, I heard footsteps crunching across the gravel in the dog runs and asked who was already back there. Sam, one of the workers, replied, "No one's back there." Confused, I insisted I could clearly hear footsteps on the gravel. Sam just shrugged and said, "I know, but no one's back there." Curious, I waited at the gate, listening to the footsteps on the other side. When I opened the gate, I saw nothing. Sam laughed, "Told ya." After that day, we all agreed that the kennel was probably haunted, but since there wasn't much we could do about it, we tried to just accept it. Soon enough, though, the strange activity ramped up, moving from minor residual sounds to what felt like a full-blown haunting. And it wasn't just any haunting, it seemed like it was by ghost dogs. Our kennel was small, and we had regulars that came in every few months. One of those was Copper, a beautiful red-bone coonhound. Strangely enough, Copper started appearing when he wasn't there. One worker came in for her shift and cheerfully reported, "Copper's back. He's out in one of the runs." I checked the schedule and saw that Copper wasn't due for the entire month. When I pointed that out, she insisted she'd seen him. I stepped out and looked in the runs myself. Each one was empty. She followed me, baffled, saying she had just seen him, or at least a red-bone hound, sitting in the first run. Another time, Sam was sitting up front while I folded laundry. All the dogs had already been let out and fed, so most were dozing in their kennels. Suddenly, Sam bolted up, grabbed a kennel lead, and ran outside, shouting that Copper was running loose through the grounds. From where I stood, I could see into Copper's kennel, and there he was curled up, sound asleep. Sam, looking a bit rattled, admitted that maybe it wasn't Copper but another red-bone hound. I grabbed a lead to help her search, But after combing through the 2-acre property, we found no sign of any loose dog. We often let the dogs out in playgroups. The big dogs would go out in small groups while the smaller ones, who usually got along well, went out in larger groups of 10 to 15. To bring them back inside, we'd open the door to the little dog yard and let them all run in, then catch them individually to return them to their kennels. The smarter dogs knew their kennels and would wait at their spots. After letting the little dogs back in, I went to put a pair of toy poodles in their kennel. I lifted the first one in, followed by the second. As I latched the kennel, I felt a small dog jump against the back of my leg. Thinking it was one of the last few loose dogs, I said, "Okay, you're next." But when I turned around, there was no dog. Just an empty corridor leading to the front of the kennel with no place for a small dog to hide. The other workers had already put up all the remaining dogs, and the 2 toy poodles were the last loose ones. Yet something or someone had jumped against my leg. We never researched the kennel's history, but there were rumors that it had once been a puppy mill, about 20 or 30 years back. Supposedly, many dogs had died on the property, which might explain the ghostly residents we encountered. Let me start by saying that I live in a house built in the 1800s, old, full of character, and undoubtedly filled with history. I don't know much about the previous owners, although my stepdad does. He avoids discussing it, worried that confirming any oddities might make me uneasy, even though I'm 21 and have lived here since I was 7. The spirit in our house isn't unfriendly. In fact, if you ask him to settle down, he actually will. I often ask him to keep things calm, especially when I'm home alone, because otherwise, my dogs get nervous and restless, which makes me feel uneasy. Since I first moved in, I've always felt like I was never entirely alone here. I was never quite comfortable in the dark or in the downstairs bedroom. It wasn't that I felt threatened. It was just a new experience that took some getting used to. My first real encounter happened with the doorbell. One day, it began ringing repeatedly, but every time I'd go to answer it, no one was there. Given that we're surrounded by a farm and acres of open land with mostly older neighbors, I knew it couldn't be someone playing a prank. I even let my German Shepherd outside to check the area, but nothing changed. As soon as I'd leave the room, the doorbell would ring again, on and off for hours until I eventually just ignored it. I wondered if it could have been my grandfather, who had recently passed, trying to reach out since I'd only met him once before. Another strange moment happened as I was walking through the living room. I caught a glimpse of someone going up the stairs in a plaid shirt. Assuming it was my sister heading to my room, I rushed upstairs to confront her, but neither she nor anyone else was up there. When I went back downstairs, I found her outside. There was no way she could have come back down without me noticing. My room is right next to the stairs, and there's only a small landing between the rooms. One night, my cousin was over, and we were chatting in my room when my mom came to the doorway to ask us something. Suddenly, a chocolate lollipop that had been sitting in a cup on my TV flew across the room, landing right at her feet. This lollipop had been sitting there for a while, a gift from a friend I'd never gotten around to eating. If it had fallen naturally, it would have landed under the TV, not across the room. We all just stared, stunned. Other times, I've been sitting on the couch in the living room, and from there, I can see into the kitchen via the reflection in our corner cabinet. At night, when the sink light is on, I sometimes see a figure moving in the kitchen, even when no one is home or everyone else is asleep. Then there are the little things like doors opening and closing on their own. My parents often feel someone sit down on the end of their bed, even seeing the corner of the bed dip slightly, as though someone's weight is pressing on it. Before I got a new bed and rearranged my room, I'd sometimes feel someone pacing beside me at night. I could feel the bed covers moving and the slight gust of air you sense when someone walks past, even hearing the floor creak occasionally. Our dogs sense things too. They'll often stand at the bottom of the stairs, staring up intently with their ears perked. Sometimes they bark as if they're seeing someone we can't see. My little dog, who's easily startled, will often be peacefully sleeping upstairs, then suddenly bolt down the stairs, yelping as if something startled her. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Not too long ago, I worked at a catering place in the Baltimore area, starting back in high school and continuing through college. One evening, while we were cleaning up, some of the guys started talking about ghost stories, and that's when one of my managers told me about a spirit named Margaret. Margaret, according to the story, was the wife of the building's former owner. She discovered her husband was cheating on her and ended up hanging herself in what used to be his office, which is now the loft or storage attic. I laughed it off at first, thinking it was just another spooky tale, but some of my coworkers swore they'd seen strange things happen around the building. For example, they said the chandeliers would sometimes sway even when there was no airflow, and I saw this myself a few times after hearing the story. A massive Christmas wreath that required plugging in would start flashing its lights on and off, even though it wasn't plugged in. One night, my manager was heading up to the new office area, while some of us were busy cleaning another room, when he said he heard the sound of an old-time radio tuning in, though the power was off and there wasn't even a radio like that in the building. Now, for my own experiences, I still wonder if they have logical explanations, but I'm not sure. The building has 3 main rooms used for events, with walls that can be raised or lowered to separate them as needed. My first experience happened one night when we had a party in one of the end rooms, and the other 2 rooms were connected and set up for an event the next day. To avoid the big crowd, I decided to go through the empty, darkened rooms to grab some glass racks from the bar. Only 1 or 2 small lights were on by the bar at the front of the room, so it was mostly pitch dark. As I reached the middle of the room, I suddenly felt a couple of taps on my shoulder. When I turned around, no one was there. I would have seen or heard someone coming in, the doors squeak, and the light from the back hallway would have lit up the room. Heart pounding, I bolted for the lobby. My second experience happened a few weeks later. We had all 3 rooms separated, with parties in the right end and middle rooms. Near the end of my shift, my manager asked me to store the flower arrangements in the beer cooler to keep them fresh for the next day. This was a typical job, so I gathered the arrangements along the bar in the empty left-end room, which connected to a hallway leading to the cooler. I'd placed about 10 arrangements along the bar and was heading to the back of the cooler to start setting them down when I heard a woman's voice quietly call my name, almost like a whisper. Startled, I sprinted out of the cooler, taking a few minutes to calm myself down and wondering if I'd imagined it. Eventually, I went back in, trying to shake off the feeling. Later, a dishwasher came into the empty room, and I told him what happened. He told me about a similar experience. Once, they had set a heavy, 15 to 20-pound object on a high shelf at the back of the dishwashing area, only to have it mysteriously fly off onto the floor. I still don't know if these were actual paranormal experiences. Maybe the tap on my shoulder was just a random muscle spasm, and the voice in the cooler was just the sound of the fans echoing in a strange way. But still, I can't quite explain why I could hear the voice so clearly over the noise of the fans. It all started when my wife and I bought our first home in Pasadena, Maryland, back in June 2005. At first, nothing unusual happened, except for 2 strange details. Our cats refused to go into the basement, and there was a constant smell of heavy perfume and cigarette smoke in our bedroom. My wife even asked me if I was smoking in the house, to which I'd always answer, no. By August, things started to shift. The cats finally warmed up to the basement, thanks to the fact that I'd put their food bowls on my workbench down there. The previous owner had turned the basement into a home theater, leaving the laundry room and workbench in the unfinished part. One afternoon around 3 p.m., I came home early to hook up a game console to the theater system. I was alone in the house, or so I thought. As I was working behind the entertainment center, I looked up and saw an older man, probably 60 or 70, walk down the stairs and cross the basement to the unfinished side. He wore tan work pants, a blue flannel shirt, and a brown hat. The sight startled me, but I shrugged it off and didn't mention it to my wife. A month later, a friend moved in with us, and we'd spend late nights hanging out in the basement, watching TV. We'd often leave a bit of a mess, and my wife would ask us to clean up. Jokingly, we'd say, "Why don't you ask the guy who lives down here to clean it up?" Looking back, probably not the smartest thing to say. Eventually, my friend moved back to Texas in October, and around then, I finally told my wife about the man I'd seen in the basement. She was a little concerned, but I assured her there was no harm. We mostly kept it to ourselves. In November, my brother came to visit, and one night while we were outside grilling, he asked me, "What's going on in my room?" I looked up to see lights floating around his room. I then told him about the man I'd seen in the basement, and how his room was directly above the spot where the man had vanished. Over time, my wife and I stopped spending much time in the basement, only going down to feed the cats or do laundry, and we never went down there alone. We even bought a new TV for the living room to avoid the basement altogether. In the living room, our cats and dog would often follow something invisible moving around the room. At the time, I didn't fully understand how animals might sense the supernatural. One incident still gives me chills, the dog bone incident. We kept our dog gated in our room at night so he wouldn't bother the cats. One night, he woke me up with frantic barking and growling, as if someone had broken in. I grabbed my pistol and flashlight, preparing to sweep the house. As I stepped over the gate, I noticed a dog biscuit lying in the middle of the hallway. This made no sense. The dog treats were stored in a cabinet above the sink, and if it had been there before bed, our dog would have found it long before. When we couldn't sell the house, we decided to rent it out, and I never asked our tenants if they'd experienced anything unusual. I didn't want to scare them off. Eventually, we had to foreclose on the house, but to this day, I wish I still owned it so I could dig into its history. It seemed like whatever had haunted us in Pasadena may have followed us. In 2009, my wife and I moved to a 2-bedroom apartment in Naperville, Illinois. It was a nice, bright place and money was tight, so we started using goldfish snack crackers as treats for our dog, since they were cheaper than regular dog treats. One morning, while I was running late, I skipped the usual snack and gave the dog a handful of cat food instead. About 15 minutes later, I heard him growling in the kitchen. Thinking nothing of it, I continued getting ready. When I finally went to the kitchen, I was shocked to find a red goldfish cracker lying in the middle of the floor. I picked it up and tried to give it to him, but he wouldn't touch it. I stood there, trying to make sense of it, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw a black mist shoot out from the laundry room. That was the first and last time anything happened in that apartment. Currently, I'm living in Iraq, working with KBR, and my wife has moved back to her hometown in eastern Pennsylvania. When I call her, I can often hear our dog barking and growling in the background. I ask her what he's barking at, and she usually responds, "Nothing, he's just lying on the couch." I can't wait to get home and see what might still be waiting for us. When I was almost 3 years old, my father passed away. At that age, I didn't understand what death was. All I knew was that he wasn't coming back, though I didn't fully grasp what that meant. We lived in a single-family home, and my sister and I shared a room with bunk beds, a dresser, and a TV, the usual things. One night, a while after my father's passing, my mother put us to bed, and I fell asleep as usual. I don't remember what time it was when I woke up or how long the event lasted, but I know it felt very real. I was startled awake, though I'm not sure what woke me. Maybe a sound or just a strange feeling. As I sat up, I noticed an older woman standing near our TV and dresser. She looked very old and, somehow, very unfriendly. I think kids just have that intuition. We can sense when someone feels wrong. Her face was covered in deep wrinkles, there wasn't a smooth spot on it. Her hair was mostly gray with some black strands and looked messy and unwashed, like it hadn't been cleaned in weeks. Her eyes were strange. They looked like regular human eyes, but her irises weren't a typical color. They were smoky gray, not blue or any other color I'd seen before. They just looked empty. The woman was smiling, but not in a warm or friendly way. It was a smile I'll never forget. It felt pure evil. I was just a young girl, and my only thought was to get to my mom, who always made me feel safe. I bolted for the door, which was across from my bed and thankfully far enough from the woman that I felt I could make it past her. My mom's room was on the other side of the house, and I ran straight there without looking back. When I reached her bed, I jumped in and curled up beside her. Looking back at the doorway, I saw the woman standing there, just watching. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed another figure in my mom's room, standing in the darkness. Unlike the woman, It wasn't a terrifying presence. It looked like a shadow, but I could make out some clothes. It felt like there was someone there, but the room was too dark to see clearly. When I turned to look directly at this figure, I felt an overwhelming sense of comfort. It was a reassuring presence. I looked back at the doorway, and the woman was gone. I honestly believed that the figure was my father, there to protect me from her. It felt like the woman sensed his presence and didn't dare enter the room, like he was too powerful for her. At this point, my mom had woken up and asked what I was looking at. I told her about the woman and the figure in her room. My mom has always been a believer in the paranormal, and with other family members who have had experiences, she took me seriously. She sat up with me until I could fall asleep again, and I ended up sleeping in her room for the next few months because of that experience. Now I'm 22, and it seems like paranormal experiences still seek me out. I don't see things as often, but I can sense them. For most of my life, it made me uneasy, and it's only recently that I've started to accept it. This is something that happened to my mother, but I felt something strange that same night too. Before I begin, I should mention that my mother has always been able to see things that others can't. She may have inherited this from her mother, who also had the ability to see and communicate with spirits. It was a few months back, sometime in July. Since school was on summer break, I'd usually stay up until 7 a.m. scrolling through my phone. But that night, I felt unusually tired and decided to sleep earlier. Around 4 a.m., I plugged in my phone to charge and went to the bathroom. Before leaving, I was suddenly overwhelmed by a feeling of not wanting to step out. For some reason, I felt safe in the bathroom, but I was tired and wanted to get to bed. It was strange because nothing had happened to make me feel scared. I shook off the feeling, turned the knob, and slowly opened the door. Standing in the doorway with the light on, I looked out into the dark hallway and into my parents' bedroom, where everything was still. I turned off the light, quickly ran to my room, and switched on the lights there before shutting the door behind me. Even after I was safely in my room, the feeling of fear wouldn't go away. I fixed my side of the bed. My sister and I share a bed. Opened the door again to peer into the darkness, then turned off the light, jumped into bed, and hid under the blankets. I turned so I wasn't facing the door and scooted close to my sister. Normally, I'd lie in bed and let my mind wander before falling asleep. But that night, I just wanted to fall asleep as fast as possible, hoping to wake up when the sun was out and my family was awake. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, I was having breakfast when my mom told us about something strange and terrifying that had happened to her while we were all asleep. Curious, we asked her what happened, and she began her story. She said she woke up during the night and found she couldn't move. She felt someone or something entering the room. Through half-open eyes, she saw 6 figures walk in and surround the bed on all sides that weren't against the wall. They stood at the foot of the bed and along her side. My parents' bed is against the wall on the left side and headboard, while my mom sleeps on the side with no wall. She described the figures as dressed in dark, purple robe-like outfits with long, pointed hats on their heads. Where their faces should have been was just a blank darkness. They walked in a single line into the room. Though my mom couldn't move, she managed to stretch her hand until it touched my 2-year-old sister's leg, as if to protect her. The one who seemed to be leading the others looked at her and shook his head slowly for a while, and then, after about 30 seconds, the figures turned around and filed out of the room. Once they were gone, my mother could move again. She checked on my sister and found that everything was fine. She said that while it was happening, she didn't feel like they were there to hurt her, but it didn't feel good either. After she finished, I told her about the strange feelings I'd had that night around the same time. Just thinking about it gives me chills. To this day, we still have no idea who those figures were or what they wanted. If anyone has ever seen similar figures or has an idea of what they could be, we'd really like to know. Why did the leader shake his head like that before leaving? And who were they? This happened about 7 or 8 years ago, so it's been a while. Back then, I was working as a new nurse at a nursing home in Baltimore, Maryland. I was assigned to the vent unit where patients, though stable, required ventilators and feeding pumps to help them. My station was in the middle of the unit in a circular nurses' station with views down 4 hallways, north, south, east, and west. The north hallway, though, was especially eerie. It was a dead end, leading only to a wall at the far end, and it always felt unsettling, especially during my night shifts. One night, a little past midnight, the whole unit was dimly lit, but the north hallway was darker than the rest. As I was going through my charts, I noticed, out of the corner of my eye, a tall shadow gliding toward a residence room down the north hall. I was facing the east side because I didn't want to look directly down that dark hallway, but even then, I saw something that wasn't supposed to be there. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling. Since it was my duty to do rounds and check on my patients, I walked down the north hallway to look in on everyone. Everything seemed normal. I saw no strange shadows, just the usual quiet and darkness. I carried on with my shift and tried not to think about it. The next day, when I came back in for my shift, the nurse giving me the report mentioned that a resident had passed away that morning in one of the rooms near the end of the north hallway. My mind immediately went back to that shadowy figure I had glimpsed the night before. It seemed like a strange coincidence, but I still brushed it off, trying not to dwell on it. A few months later, I had another experience that really shook me. It was past midnight again, and I was giving some scheduled medications. I was on the north hallway, and everything was quiet, with only the occasional ding or alarm from the ventilators. Nothing unusual until I stepped into one particular room. The lights were off, making the room dark, with only a dim glow from the hallway behind me. The room had a large window, and usually the blinds would be closed at night, but here they were open, making the window reflect the hallway behind me like a mirror. I couldn't see outside, but I could see my own reflection clearly. Right away, I felt a strange presence, as if something was behind me. My whole body tensed up, and I felt the hairs on my neck stand up as my heart began to pound. As I fumbled along the wall, searching for the light switch, my eyes glanced at the window reflection, and there, right behind me, was the shadowy figure again. A tall, dark outline standing close enough that my heart nearly stopped. The moment I found the switch, I turned it on, and the figure disappeared from the reflection. I was so shaken that I kept quiet for the rest of my shift, focusing on my work to keep my mind occupied. One of my coworkers asked if I was all right, and I said I was, though inside I was anything but okay. When I returned to work the next night, I heard that another patient had passed away that morning, in the same room where I had seen the shadow. I still don't know what I saw in those two encounters, but I can't forget it. Felt like death itself was visiting. I don't know if they were grim reapers or something else entirely, but it's a memory I'll never forget from my time working in that place. I've had this cross necklace since high school. I first began wearing it during a strange time in my life, when something unsettling would happen to me every night, always at exactly 3 a.m. For no reason. I'd wake up and feel this intense, eerie sensation of being watched. It happened night after night. On the third night, it became terrifying. I had a vivid dream of Jesus, but then his face transformed into something dark and sinister, almost demonic. I jolted awake, unable to sleep well for days afterward, feeling shaken by whatever dark force I had encountered. To this day, I sometimes wonder if these experiences had anything to do with something my friends and I had done at a nearby shore. There's a public area by the sea, with a restaurant and hotel nearby, and part of it is secluded, surrounded by tall grass and trees. One day, we decided to experiment with witchcraft in that spot, not taking it seriously, just thinking it was fun. But ever since then, I started sensing this negative energy following me around, something I couldn't shake. Being sensitive to energies and emotions, I felt it almost constantly, like a dark presence just out of sight. I needed some protection, so I started wearing a cross necklace that a friend had blessed and gifted to me. From the first time I put it on, I felt a little safer, like a calming shield around me. That's when I made it my personal mantra, silently praying that this cross would protect me from harm. I also vowed that if I ever did something wrong or unworthy, I would lose the necklace. Over the years, something strange kept happening with that necklace. Whenever I lost it, it would somehow return to me, almost like it was meant to stay by my side. Here are a few times that happened. One morning, I was dropping my mom off at work at a hospital in Maryland. As I was driving, I realized my necklace wasn't around my neck. I felt a chill, immediately sensing something was wrong. After returning home, I searched every inch of my room, my bed, even the yard, but it was nowhere to be found. Disappointed, I gave up and went back to my room, and there it was, lying perfectly in the middle of my pillow, as if someone had placed it there just for me to find. I was relieved to have it back, even though the way it reappeared was strange. Another time, I felt the necklace slip off while I was outside in the front yard. I watched as it slid down my chest and fell into the grass. Confident I'd find it, I bent down to pick it up, but it was gone. I searched for nearly half an hour, combing through the grass, retracing my steps, but there was nothing. Frustrated, I went back inside to get out of the heat, and there it was again on my pillow just like the last time. Bizarre as it was, I was happy to have it back. But the strangest experience with the necklace happened in 2013. By then, I had given it to my boyfriend, now my husband, because I felt it would protect him. I had always promised myself that I'd only give the necklace to someone truly special, someone I was deeply connected to. At the time, I was in Maryland talking to him over Skype. There was a massive typhoon headed toward his hometown in the Philippines, where he lived near the coast. I warned him about the storm, and he assured me that he and his family were safe at home, even though officials had urged people in their area to evacuate. Then, as the typhoon hit, I lost all contact with him. I spent 24 agonizing hours trying to reach him, but there was no response. I was glued to the computer, frantically checking news updates. Early the next morning, I saw the first televised reports of the devastation. The storm surge had hit the coastline hard, washing through his area and taking countless lives. Terrified, I feared the worst. My mother took me to church to pray before I booked a flight back to the Philippines, hoping for a miracle. Just before I was about to leave, I received a text from a friend connected to his family, telling me everyone was safe. Relief washed over me, and I was overwhelmed with gratitude. He later told me how he and his family had survived the storm by climbing to their roof to escape the rising water. Many who went to the evacuation shelters didn't make it, as those buildings were hit hardest by the storm surge. Somehow, he and his family survived, but the necklace, he said, had fallen into the floodwaters and was lost. A month later, while visiting his family in the northern Philippines, we were at a pool when his brother suddenly stopped and pointed to something at the bottom of the water. It was the necklace, the same cross I had given him, now hundreds of miles from where he'd lost it during the storm. After we got married in Baltimore in 2014, he returned the necklace to me. We moved to Texas 5 years ago, and one day, as I was leaving work, I felt it slip off my neck in the parking lot. I searched everywhere but couldn't find it. To this day, the necklace hasn't returned to me, and sometimes I wonder if it's because of something I did or didn't do. But deep down, I still hope it will come back to me, just like it always has. I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts, and even as a kid, I often had a strange feeling at night, like there was something happening around me that I couldn't quite grasp. Years later, talking with my younger sister, she revealed she'd felt the exact same way. There were a lot of small but strange occurrences I remember. For example, when I was home alone, I'd often hear 2 or 3 knocks on my bedroom door. It was wooden and had a distinct sound, so there was no mistaking it. The weirdest thing I remember happened one night when I was about 11 or 12. I was lying in bed, facing the wall with my back toward the door, when I suddenly felt a couple of light taps on my shoulder. I froze. I wasn't sure if I should turn around or just try to ignore it and go back to sleep. But curiosity won, and I slowly turned over, only to see a small figure floating in midair. I know this sounds strange, but I swear it happened. I hadn't been dreaming, and I even pinched myself to make sure I was awake. I wish I could recall more details, but that's as clear as my memory allows. Other strange things happened over the years too, like cool air blowing across my face when the windows were closed and random shadows appearing. Let me tell you about the shadows. When I got older, I moved from an upstairs room to a room downstairs, in our basement area that also served as a laundry and computer room. Even now, I feel a bit silly talking about it because logically these experiences seem almost impossible. But I remember countless times waking up in the middle of the night, or even lying awake and seeing shadows in my room. And I don't mean a coat hanging on a chair or some trick of the light. I mean actual shadows standing over my bed. Sometimes they looked like people, other times they were formless, but they always terrified me. There's nothing quite like waking up at 15 years old to a shadowy figure just standing there, silently watching you. To this day, I don't think anything has scared me more. Honestly, whether or not these experiences were supernatural, they left me with big questions. What do these experiences mean? Are they coincidences? Do they serve a higher purpose? I don't know. But since those early years, I've encountered plenty of other strange events that still leave me scratching my head. Here's another example. A few years ago, some friends and I were headed to a performance. A couple of us drove to a friend's house to meet before the show, and about a half-mile away from the house, I suddenly got a horrible headache and felt nauseous. When we went inside, it got worse. I felt this overwhelming sense that I shouldn't be there. I took an aspirin and tried to ignore it. Right before we were about to leave, I was walking down the hallway when a mirror fell off the wall and cut my hand. Now, a mirror falling isn't that unusual, but I was standing at least 6 inches away from it when it happened. I reached out to try and grab it, but it was already on its way down. The strange part? As soon as we left the house and started driving, I immediately felt better. In isolation, none of these events might sound remarkable, but there have been so many of them, ranging from minor oddities to outright mysteries. Together, they leave me questioning how much I should believe and how much I should just let go. I have plenty more stories, each one stranger than the last, and I still don't have any answers. We had a dog named Rags when I was a kid. By the time I was 11, she was already very old, so it wasn't a huge shock when she passed. But for years afterward, while I lay cowering under the covers in my childhood bedroom, I could still hear the soft clicking of her nails on the linoleum kitchen floor. My parents chalked it up to an overactive imagination. They kept telling me the same thing even when I was 16 and still slept with the covers pulled over my head. But it wasn't just Rags. It was everything else in the house too. Little noises and sounds I couldn't explain. For as long as I could remember, I'd wake up to the sound of someone whispering my name right in my ear. The voice was so loud, it jolted me awake. But was it just a dream? As I got older, it became easier to brush these things off as childhood fears, and for a few years I managed to do just that. Then, when I turned 22, I moved into a new apartment with my boyfriend, and soon, that same eerie feeling returned. I can't fully explain it, but something just felt wrong. After years of feeling secure, it was back. Many nights, I'd lie awake, watching a shadow move back and forth in front of the bedroom door. Eventually, I started waking up to the sensation of fingers poking and prodding my legs, or feeling warm breath in my ear. One night, I was sitting on the bed, talking with my boyfriend, and we both heard a man's voice say, "Hello," from the living room. We checked, but no one was there. Even my cats began acting out of character. One night, I was sitting on the couch alone when I heard the unmistakable creak of my office chair, as if someone had just sat down and was rocking it slowly back and forth. Both of my cats were on the couch with me, so I knew they weren't the cause. I finally moved out of that apartment. I hated the way it felt. The new place felt much better, but strange things continued to happen. Doors would slam shut as I walked past, even though no windows were open. One night, I woke up and could swear I saw a little boy standing at the foot of my bed. On another morning, my boyfriend told me he'd woken up the night before, thinking I was kneeling at the foot of our bed. But when he looked over, I was lying there next to him, sound asleep. Then there was a night I was watching TV with my friend Olivia. Out of nowhere, Olivia stood up and walked across the room to stand by the door, without saying a word. She just stood there, still watching the TV. 2 seconds later, a loud bang echoed from the wall right behind where she'd been sitting. To this day, she can't remember why she got up and walked away just moments before the noise. So I don't know. Am I haunted? Or is it just the result of an overactive imagination? I know there's life after death. I know spirits are real, and I believe that if you're receptive, things will happen. It's a beautiful thing, and I only wish it happened more often to me. I've always been fascinated by the spiritual world. I've dabbled in astral projection, had some memorable sessions with the Ouija board, and even had dreams that feel like visits from beyond. I lost my mom 12 years ago when I was 26. She had a very aggressive brain tumor that took her life just 3 weeks after her first symptom appeared. We were incredibly close, like sisters, and when she passed, I was devastated. I still cry sometimes, even in my sleep. She was only 48, and with my dad having passed when I was 15, I felt like an orphan when she left. I had relied on her for support in every way. Mom passed away in March that year. When Christmas rolled around, the first one without her, I went home to Massachusetts to spend Christmas Eve with my grandmother, my mom's mother. Before going to her house, I stopped by the cemetery to visit my mom's grave. It was a cold, snowy day, and I was feeling incredibly sad, lonely, and lost, still in the depths of grief. I stood at her gravesite and told her how much I missed her and needed to know that she was watching over me. I asked her if she could give me a sign or let me see her just one more time, just to feel close to her. I looked around, hoping to see or hear something, but nothing happened. Feeling defeated, I got back in the car and headed to my grandmother's house. It was early afternoon, and we didn't need to be at my uncle's for a few hours, so I lay down on the bed to rest while my grandmother sat on the couch in the same room. We were both struggling that day, but neither of us wanted to bring it up. I hadn't even told her about my visit to the cemetery because I didn't want to make her cry. As I lay there, my thoughts drifted to Mom. Suddenly, the TV across the room turned on by itself. I looked over at my grandmother, and she just smiled and said, "Angels." I smiled back and said, "Yes, I know." We didn't say anything else, but we both understood. The TV had never turned on by itself before, and the remote was on a table nowhere near either of us. It was the sign I'd asked for and Mom delivered. That moment felt so special, and it soothed me for the rest of the Christmas season. It may not sound all that profound to some, but for me it had a huge impact. Mom also visits me regularly in my dreams, and I believe this is her way of staying connected with me and letting me know she's still around. A few months ago, she came to me in a dream that felt particularly vivid. Usually, I dream of her in the house I grew up in, but this time it was in the home my husband and I bought 4 years ago. In the dream, I was in my kitchen trying to call our dog to let him outside, but he kept looking over his shoulder and wouldn't come to the bottom of the stairs. I kept calling him, and finally he came down. And right behind him, Mom walked down the stairs too. I ran across the room and threw my arms around her, giving her the biggest hug. I was crying as I asked, "Mom, you're here." She hugged me back and said, "Of course I'm here. Thanks, Mom. I still miss you more than you know, and I'll never forget all the memories we shared." When I was 9 years old, I was thrilled to move into our new home. I finally had my own room, but only a few months later, that excitement turned into a different kind of thrill. One day, our family of 5 went to the circus, leaving the house empty for the day. When we returned, we found the round light fixture from the bottom of the stairs on the floor, upside down, tucked in a corner. Oddly, it was in perfect condition, and 2 of the 3 screws that usually bolted it to the ceiling were right underneath it, while the third was still in the ceiling. My parents discussed who had keys to the house and called my grandmother, the only person with a spare, to ask if she'd been there that day. She hadn't, and had no idea what we were talking about. We were left with a mystery that lingered in all of our minds, and I remember feeling excited about the possibility of the paranormal, even at that young age. Only a few months later, we had another unexplained event. It was September 1982, my brother's birthday, and we had family over for cake. We kids were all playing upstairs, my brothers and the boys in his room, while the girls and I were in mine. When we were called down for cake, everything was normal, but when my brothers tried to go back into their bedroom afterward, the door wouldn't budge. My dad and uncle came upstairs to see what was wrong, and to their surprise, they found that the bureau, which normally sat against the wall, had somehow been pushed right up against the door from the inside, blocking it completely. My dad and uncle forced the door open, and once inside, we saw that the windows were closed and locked. There was no closet or place to hide, and we did a head count to confirm everyone had been accounted for downstairs the entire time. We were stumped. In time, things settled down, but we'd tell our friends these ghost stories with pride. Friends who stayed over claimed they saw the eyes in my mother's wedding picture turn red. We even had little seances with neighborhood friends, rigging up things like baseball trophies to fall as pranks. If there were any spirits around, they seemed to be lying low, just quietly observing. But a few years later, things started to happen again. My brother once told me he'd been listening to music in his room when he heard his name being called from the bottom of the stairs. When he turned the music down and looked, he saw a white floaty thing at the base of the staircase. I brushed it off, thinking he was tired or maybe imagining things. Then, a few months later, it happened to me. I was home alone, listening to music in my room, when I heard someone call my name from downstairs. I turned down the volume and peeked outside my door a few times, but saw nothing. Finally, I called out, convinced I'd heard something, and that's when I saw the white floaty thing at the bottom of the stairs. Though part of me wanted to communicate with it, the reality was a lot scarier than the idea. I backed into my room, shut the door, and sat on my bed, staring at the locked door with my radio turned low. My interest in the paranormal only grew over the years, and a friend of mine with a Ouija board convinced me to try it. We often contacted what we believed was a spirit, having conversations throughout our high school years. Eventually, my younger brother and his friends started using the Ouija board on their own. I didn't join them that time, but I remember vividly what happened next. One evening, my brother and his friends approached me, saying that the Ouija board had contacted them as a boy who claimed he had died in our house. He said his body was buried under the 4th floorboard from the front of the house. My brother wanted permission to rip up the carpet in his room to check. Our mom wasn't home, so somehow, this decision fell to me. I told him I couldn't give him permission, but if he did it, I'd like to be there. They peeled back the carpet, but found nothing under the floorboard. However, there was a small area behind a slanted wall that wasn't accessible. A narrow space too tight to even crawl into. My brother suggested putting a small hole in the wall to see what might be in there. Once again, I refused to give permission, but I didn't stop them from doing it. We cut a hole, shined a flashlight in, and saw a white material on the floor. When we pulled it out, it turned out to be 2 boys' t-shirts. My brothers decided to take the shirts to the cemetery, where they buried them in a box. Strangely, after that night, the house felt quieter, and we were never able to make contact through the Ouija board again. To this day, I wonder about that experience. Whether it was real or simply a string of eerie coincidences, it's left a lasting impression on me. My mom has always had a kind of sixth sense about things. She's intuitive in a way that goes beyond just mother's intuition, and has always had a knack for sensing things that most people can't. She sees shadows, mists, and even people at times. She comes from a big family, though her siblings haven't been close ever since our family matriarch, my grandmother, passed away in 1997. Even before my grandmother's death, family relationships were strained, especially with my Uncle Gene, the black sheep of the family. My mom and Gene were incredibly close, being the 2 youngest. Gene followed in his father's footsteps, working construction by day and serving as a firefighter by night. After struggling with addiction and time in rehab, he was so proud of his comeback. He was just a big kid at heart, always playing pranks, singing oldies to us, and teaching us songs while he played piano. He took us all around Boston, sharing stories and even ghost tales. Gene was the kind of uncle you could count on no matter what. In 1998, we moved to Maine, which made it harder to see family, but Gene always stayed in touch. He sent cards for birthdays, Christmas, and anniversaries, and he visited whenever he could. But in recent years, his addictions resurfaced and he stopped reaching out. Even with my mom, his closest family member, he became distant. She was devastated. The last time I talked to him was at Christmas, when he was upset that I hadn't told him about starting college. In the spring, when he didn't send birthday cards, my mom tried calling him, but he never called back. One day, as I was planning to move into my new apartment, my mom turned to me and said, "Something's wrong. I just know it. I think something's happened to Gene." She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a serious tone in her voice that I knew wasn't just a feeling. On July 3, 2007, I came home from work to find my mom looking bewildered. She said again, "Something's wrong with Jean. We need to go to Boston." So we started our 3-hour drive. Every song on the radio seemed to be one that Jean had played, sang, or seen in concert with my mom. It was eerie. As we reached the Tobin Bridge in Boston, Jim Croce's Time in a Bottle came on. The time was exactly 8:21 p.m. My mom looked over at me, and when the song ended, I checked my phone. My cousin was calling, but he didn't want to talk to my mom, so I didn't mention it. Seconds later, my dad called and told me to ask Mom to pull over. She heard him through the phone and started crying, realizing something terrible had happened. At 8:21 p.m., the same Time in a Bottle was playing. My uncle had accidentally overdosed. It broke our hearts, and my mom felt the song had been a message from him. To this day, I haven't randomly heard that song again. The week after we laid him to rest, I returned to Maine, moving into my new apartment, ready to cope the way most college students would. Drinking, crying, trying to forget. As I looked around my new room, I thought, I need a drink. The second thought that crossed my mind was, well, at least everything's unpacked and clean. I left my room for just a moment, but when I came back, my desk chair was sitting directly across from my bed, facing it. It looked exactly like how an elder or parent would sit if they were about to give a serious talk. I asked my roommates if they'd been in my room, but they hadn't. I took the hint and drank less that night. That same week, a butterfly appeared in the fire station where my uncle worked, hanging around the lockers and the break room, almost as if it were waiting. It didn't leave until someone finally said, "Listen, Gino, your work here is done. It's okay now." My uncle's close friend, also a firefighter, had a ritual with him. Every morning they'd get coffee together. A few days after his passing, the friend brought 2 coffees to the station out of habit. He placed them both on the table. Moments later, one of the coffees suddenly lifted, hovered for a second, and then tipped over onto the floor. The table was steady, there was no wind, and he wasn't close enough to have touched it. No one could explain it. Then, just last month, we were moving things out of Jean's house when the keys to the moving truck went missing. My dad was the last to have them, but he'd only been on the porch and in the kitchen. We spent an hour looking before finally checking the attic closet, where we found the keys, even though my dad hadn't been near it. My aunt and cousin, who had been on rocky terms with Jean before he passed, have both been visited by him in dreams. In these dreams, he smiles at my aunt and talks to my cousin, giving them a sense of peace about his sudden passing. I'll never forget the night I first saw the ghost that haunts my bedroom. I just moved from the 3rd floor of our house down to the basement for more space and privacy since my older brother had moved out. Felt like the perfect setup. One night I was sound asleep. Normally I sleep like a rock, and it takes a lot to wake me up. But suddenly my eyes shot open. I wasn't groggy or disoriented, just very awake and aware. The first thing I saw was the bright red glow of my alarm clock, reading 3:15 a.m. I slowly glanced around my room, and that's when I saw her. She was standing at the foot of my bed, an older woman, short and on the heavier side, wearing a shawl draped over her shoulders. Her hair was neatly pulled back in a tight bun, and she looked like the classic old Italian grandmother type. Her expression was serious, almost stern, but not angry or mean. Her entire figure was a grayish-white hue, yet I could clearly make out her facial features. I will never forget her face. I was so stunned, I couldn't move. I felt frozen with shock, unable to convey any emotion. Fear, sadness, even curiosity. Strangely, I didn't feel scared. After about 15 to 20 seconds of silent eye contact, I managed to slam my eyes shut, and when I reopened them, she was gone. Somehow, I managed to fall back asleep that night, and since then, I've understood that she wasn't a dark spirit. She's never made me feel afraid. Since that night, I've had many strange things happen in my room, though I haven't seen her again. Pictures will fall off the walls in the middle of the night. Candles or random objects are sometimes flung across the room. My door will creak open and hit the wall with a thud at random times, and my jewelry has vanished without a trace. My girlfriend once lost a pair of gold earrings, and several of my earrings and chains have disappeared too. At this point, I've accepted that I share my bedroom with a ghost. If she's messing with me, I'll simply say aloud, "Cut it out," or "Stop it," and it usually does the trick. I've come to see myself as someone with a gift for experiencing the paranormal, and over the years, I've learned to accept it, even cherish it. Not everyone has this ability, and I can sense when I enter a place if spirits or energies are present. One time, my girlfriend and I were babysitting my niece at my sister's house. Suddenly, we both heard faint but unmistakable children's whispers over the baby monitor. Even though my niece was only a few months old and hadn't started babbling yet, I rushed upstairs, thinking someone had broken into the house, only to find my niece sound asleep in a deathly quiet room. I'm convinced that someone drowned in our second-floor bathtub. When I was younger, I loved taking baths, but at some point, I became terrified. I'd imagine a stranger's hands holding me underwater whenever I dunked my head to rinse shampoo out. My mom later told me she used to see the ghost of a woman walking back and forth between the bathroom, where I had my visions, and what used to be my bedroom upstairs. One night, while driving home from a friend's place, I glanced over to the passenger seat and saw the faint figure of a little girl sitting next to me. I slammed the car to a stop, got out, and had to take a moment to collect myself. Just last night, I was at a friend's house, which is also known for paranormal activity. As we were watching TV, I thought to myself, I've never had any weird experiences here. I wonder why. Right then, there was a loud bang on his bedroom door, so startling that everyone in the room jumped in horror. There was no one else in the house. As I said, I've reached a point where I accept that the paranormal is drawn to me. I truly believe it's a gift rather than a burden. I've yet to experience anything dark or negative, though that could change, lol. But for now, I accept it, and honestly, I think it's pretty cool. Almost 10 years ago, I rented an apartment in Quinsigamon Village, a part of Worcester, Massachusetts known for its history as a home to generations of Swedish immigrants who once worked in the nearby mills. The apartment was in a classic three-decker house, full of charm. An old cast-iron clawfoot tub, a built-in china cabinet, and the rent was surprisingly low for such a large space. I signed the lease quickly, feeling like I'd gotten a great deal. But it didn't take long for me to realize things weren't quite right in that place. I was single and living alone, and at first it was just small oddities. A faucet left running, a picture on the wall somehow upside down, or a coffee cup I'd left on the kitchen table inexplicably showing up in the bathroom. I brushed it off as carelessness on my part, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One night, I woke to the sound of the phone ringing from the kitchen, but strangely, the phone in my bedroom was silent and the caller ID showed no incoming call. I wrote it off as a quirk of the old building's wiring. Then, another night, I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of shattering glass. I ran to the window, expecting to see someone investigating the noise, but there was only silence. The next morning, I checked all around but couldn't find a single shard of glass anywhere. As winter set in, I started noticing more unsettling things. One morning, I felt a chill and discovered the window in the pantry wide open. My dad suggested that vibrations from street traffic might have nudged it open, but a few days later it happened again, this time in the bathroom. I'd also hear the front door open, only to find it still locked, just as I'd left it. The most frightening incident happened when I was homesick from work. I was lying on the sofa in the living room, watching a movie. The couch was up against a wall with a closet door next to it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something white streak across the baseboard, moving with incredible speed. It disappeared behind a chair in the opposite corner, then reappeared just as quickly, before vanishing under the TV stand. My blood ran cold. I'd never felt that kind of fear before and sat frozen on the sofa, my eyes glued to the TV stand. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered the courage to inspect behind the stand. I tilted it forward and looked. Nothing. By then, my whole body was trembling. I was sure I'd witnessed something truly unexplainable, and I felt so overwhelmed I began to cry. I didn't know who to call. Who would believe this? I was angry, too. I started walking from room to room, calling out for whatever it was to leave, and I recited the Lord's Prayer out loud. That night, I dreamed I was chasing something invisible around the apartment. I woke up feeling a bit lighter, but the peace didn't last. About a week later, I came home from work and felt a heavy sense of dread as I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. When I inserted my key into the lock, a spark shot out of the metal doorknob and left a red mark on my thumb. I felt a powerful, menacing presence in the kitchen, and though I couldn't see anything, I was terrified. Again, I recited the Lord's Prayer, gripping the back of a chair to steady myself, feeling as if I might be lifted off the ground by something unseen. Finally, the feeling passed, but I kept the lights on that night and wondered if I should just leave the place. The last disturbing event happened that spring. Back then, I was young, single, and frequently went out to bars and clubs in Boston. Before I left, I always made sure my 3 ferrets were secure in their cage with plenty of food and water. One Sunday, I returned home and opened the kitchen door to find an empty milk jug standing upright in the center of the floor, as if placed there for me to see. It had somehow traveled over the hardwood floor and across a rug to that spot. Then one of my ferrets walked by. All 3 of them were out of their cage, which had been left open in the middle, a door I rarely used. They hadn't had food or water all weekend. I still wonder if there's any logical explanation for it. I finally moved out in September 2001, and by then, most of the strange activity had died down. A coworker who claimed to be psychic once told me my apartment was on a spirit highway, and that spirits were drawn to an energy grid beneath the building. I've never been one for horoscopes or psychics, so I took it with a grain of salt, but I do wonder what kept me there as long as I stayed. Maybe I'm just stubborn or crazy. When I packed up the living room before moving to Arizona, I finally moved the TV stand all the way. There, tucked into a corner underneath, was a little white power ball, the kind you get from a gumball machine for $0.25. A shiver ran down my spine. Needless to say, the power ball stayed behind. I stayed in touch with the people living on the other floors for a while. One neighbor admitted to feeling spirits there, but no one else seemed to experience what I did. Eventually, we lost touch. This experience happened back in 2009 when my family moved into an old house that was built in the 1960s. It was a 2-story house with 4 bedrooms, 2 on the 2nd floor, where my little brother and I each had a room, and 2 on the 1st floor, including the master bedroom for my parents and a room for my older brother. There was also a basement, but we rarely went down there unless necessary. The basement was always cold, even during the summer, and I often felt like someone was down there with us, unseen. I've always been sensitive to energies around me. It's hard to describe, but it feels like a tingling sensation at the back of my head or down my arms, depending on where that energy seems to concentrate. Along with this sensation, I sometimes feel a surge of intense emotions, like sadness or unease, which makes it easy for me to pick up on the energy of a place. In our basement, that sensation was overwhelming. Every time I went down there, it felt like a heavy sadness, as if I wanted to cry but couldn't. I brushed it off as just my imagination or maybe thought I was having a low day, even though I didn't really have a reason to feel that way. A few nights into our time at that house, something happened that shook me deeply. My room was on the 2nd floor, and one night I was fast asleep when a strong presence filled my room, waking me up with an intense feeling that I wasn't alone. It was like someone was standing there, watching me with a powerful stare. I can't fully explain it, but I was jolted awake because I felt eyes on me, an intense gaze that I couldn't ignore. My room was dark, with just a dim glow from the streetlight outside filtering through the window. As I became fully awake, I looked toward the middle of my room, and there he was, a tall African-American man in a military uniform. The uniform was pristine, dark green, neatly pressed, with medals or badges on his chest, like the formal dress uniform you see on military personnel in ceremonies. There was no blood, no signs of injury, just a clean, sharp uniform. But it was enough to tell me right away that he wasn't alive. I couldn't figure out how he could be standing there, staring at me, in the middle of my room. He didn't seem hostile or threatening, but his intense gaze was unnerving. He just stood there, staring at me silently. I felt a mix of fear and sadness, like his energy was radiating something heavy. Before I could get even more frightened, I started praying in my mind, asking him gently, "Can you go now? I'm kind of scared." Then I recited the Lord's Prayer. After a few moments, he began to fade away, vanishing into thin air as if he'd never been there. And with him, that heavy feeling of sadness and emotional weight also lifted, leaving my room feeling lighter. After that night, I never felt anything strange in the house again. We lived there for nearly 6 years, and it was as if the presence had finally moved on. What shocked me later was that my older brother, who is deaf and mute, told me something similar in sign language. He said he often saw a soldier coming out of a huge tree in our backyard. He described the figure as a soldier, just like the one I'd seen in my room. I was stunned. It was strange and unsettling, but also felt like confirmation that I hadn't imagined it. To this day, I don't know who that soldier was or why he appeared, but it's an experience I'll never forget. April 20th, 2016, my 9th grade year. Our German class had a special trip planned, a visit to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. My German teacher had this tradition of taking her students there every other year, and this year I was part of that trip. Our journey began with a train ride from Frederick, Maryland, to Union Station in Washington, D.C., with my entire German 1 class. When we arrived at Union Station, our teacher split us into small groups of 5, telling us to get food, use the restroom, and then regroup in the center of the station. Once everyone returned, we walked to a nearby bus stop that took us straight to the Holocaust Museum. At the museum entrance, I chose 4 other students to be in my group, though the only name I remember now is Jason's. After a routine bag check, we entered the museum and sat through a 25-minute introductory lecture. When it was over, Frau released us to explore the museum with our groups. As we approached the first exhibit, I felt uneasy, like something heavy was in the air. I instinctively reached for my rosary, silently praying for protection. I must have only been praying for a couple of minutes when Jason, a dedicated atheist, turned to me, saying, "Stop praying, you're hurting me." Startled, I stopped, putting my rosary back in my purse without finishing my prayer. Little did I know that would be the start of a strange and overwhelming experience. We began walking through the museum, everyone around me acting normal and respectful. But for me, things quickly took a turn. I felt lightheaded, and at first, I thought it was just a mild headache since I hadn't taken Advil before the trip. But as we moved deeper into the exhibits, my lightheadedness worsened. Soon, I felt like the entire left side of my back was on fire, an intense sensation that made me squint with discomfort. The farther we went, the more intense these strange feelings became. Eventually, we reached a bridge made of glass, with long glass panels on either side. Beyond the panels were rows of real shoes, each one a tragic reminder of the lives lost. As I walked across the bridge, the pain in my body grew sharper. Now it felt like something was kicking me hard in the lower back with a metal-toed boot. It was more than just a minor discomfort. It felt as if the pain was trying to overpower me. Crossing that bridge, we passed a glass case displaying a Nazi flag. I stopped in my tracks, feeling compelled to look at it. That's when I saw him, a man slightly transparent, definitely not from our time. He was covered in blood and soot, his clothes tattered, and a dark bruise circled one eye. My pain flared, and I felt frozen, unable to look away from this haunting figure. Jason noticed I had stopped moving and called my name, snapping me back to the present. I forced myself to move, rejoining the group, but by then the pain was almost unbearable. I felt so weak I thought I might pass out. Dry tear stains marked my cheeks from silently crying, but I pressed on, determined to reach the final part of the museum. Then we entered the Hall of Remembrance. The moment I stepped into that space, every bit of pain, every strange sensation disappeared, as if none of it had ever happened. I felt a profound peace settle over me, and for the rest of the day, I was lighthearted, laughing with my classmates and enjoying the sights of D.C. When the train brought us back to Frederick, I met up with my dad, and as we drove home, I told him everything that had happened in the museum, the pain, the apparition, the overwhelming emotions. He listened, shocked but calm, and then suggested that maybe it was Jesus allowing me to experience the suffering and pain felt by the Jews during the Holocaust, a reminder of what they endured. Now, years later, I'm 18 and have graduated high school, but that experience has stayed with me. I still believe that the man I saw was an apparition, a spirit lingering with those memories. I'm no skeptic. I believe in ghosts and that what I felt was real. My dad's words continue to resonate with me, and to this day, I have not had another experience quite like that. This is a memory that will stay with me forever, a haunting yet profound moment etched in my mind. I'm someone who's always known ghosts. I don't remember a time when they didn't feel real to me, and I've never doubted their existence. Alongside this, I've always been a lucid dreamer, a part of myself that's been hardwired from as early as I can remember. But being so sensitive to spirits and vivid dreams wasn't easy when I was very young, especially before I could even talk well. It made for a lot of confusing, sometimes terrifying experiences, memories that might have faded with age if they hadn't been so clear. To give you an idea of how long I've been aware, I can remember things from as young as 18 months. I've even had memories verified by my surprised parents, things that weren't captured in photos or influenced by them. Memory can be a tricky thing, but in this case, the memories of those early years are crystal clear. There were two main spiritual experiences that defined my childhood, one warm and comforting and the other dark and heavy. My parents thought my imaginary friends were just that, figments of my imagination. But they were more than that to me. They were two men, Goosap and Pop Pop, who dressed in Hawaiian shirts and khaki pants, drove a red convertible, and lived in a small cottage in the country. I dreamed about them often, and I associated them with God and other spiritual beings. They were kind and gentle, and I felt safe around them. I'd even pack a bag and wait on the porch, ready for them to pick me up, only to fall asleep in the twilight, my anticipation carrying into my dreams. I remember one night, they explained that they only existed in dreams and couldn't meet me in reality. I was crushed and saw them less and less after that, though they still appeared occasionally. The darker presence, however, was what I called Frankenstein. I don't remember when I started using that name, but it was the only thing that seemed to fit. While I felt safe and comfortable during the day, nighttime brought an overwhelming sense of dread. When the shadows in my room reached a certain angle and everyone was fast asleep, I'd hear the unmistakable sounds of chains clanking and deep groaning sounds, filling me with fear. It was always at the same time of night. Although I didn't have a clock, the shadows and eerie timing were consistent. We lived a pretty simple life, so our house was always dark at night. My dad was very eco-conscious, and we didn't leave any lights on. The fear would always build after midnight, and the only comfort I had were my cats, Pablo and Ezra. They'd come running whenever the chains started rattling. The three of us were inseparable, sleeping together in my crib. Whenever my parents tried to separate us, we'd cry uncontrollably until we were reunited. When Ezra passed away, I remember asking my mom where he was, not understanding death, but feeling an emptiness. And still, Frankenstein continued his nightly hauntings. For years, the fear led to a lot of bedwetting because I was too terrified to walk through the dark house. Down the hall, especially with a creepy mask hanging nearby and Frankenstein echoing through the shadows. On rare nights when I dared to call out to my parents, they'd eventually come in, groggy and half asleep, turning on the lights, which always made the sound stop, until they went back to bed. My little sister was born when I was 3.5, but I continued to experience Frankenstein both before and after she arrived. At some point, I moved from my crib to a bed, and Pablo would always sleep beside me, coming running whenever Frankenstein began. I still remember one night, just before bedtime, when I walked into my room and saw a pair of red eyes staring back at me from under the bed. I was sure my parents would see them, so I screamed for them, determined to prove it was real. But Pablo got there first, darting under the bed. When my parents arrived and turned on the lights, I saw the eyes for a second longer before they vanished. My parents, of course, insisted it was just my imagination. As I got older, around 8, I finally got a watch which confirmed that the hauntings happened consistently around 2 a.m. I would still hear those chains and groaning, though I had learned to cope by either reading with a flashlight or waiting for the sounds to pass. My sister, always a deep sleeper, never heard any of it and would sleep right through. To this day, she can only wake with alarms that vibrate and blare. Even back then, I envied how easily she slept through it all. Eventually, we moved, and I thought I'd finally left Frankenstein behind. At the time, I was close to our caretaker, Mrs. Lewis, who was like family. She lived just a block away and had cared for me between ages 2 and 10. Though I hadn't told her much about my experiences, I was deeply curious about ghosts and would often ask her questions. I loved going to church with her, finding comfort in the incense, music, and rituals of our Episcopalian services. Mrs. Lewis understood my fascination, and as we prepared to move, I finally told her everything about Frankenstein and the strange, nightly sounds. That's when Mrs. Lewis shared something that stayed with me. She told me about an old trolley line that used to run from D.C. to our town, one of the first of its kind. Our neighborhood had been developed in the 1950s and 60s, long after the trolley was gone, but it had once run right through what became our area. She explained that in her time it was believed the tracks had been built by prisoners. She said it was common knowledge back then that chain gangs of prisoners had laid the tracks, forced laborers bound in chains. It all clicked. The sounds of chains and groaning suddenly made sense. Now, even though I can't find any official records to verify it, it fits too perfectly. As a small child, I couldn't have known this history or imagined it, especially when I couldn't yet speak or read. And while I no longer fear Frankenstein, I feel sadness and empathy for him. It seems he was an emotional imprint of pain and agony, perhaps mixed with other spirits, like the red eyes under my bed. He was less of a conscious entity and more of an echo of suffering, something unwilling to be forgotten. To this day, Mrs. Lewis and I are close, and she still remembers our conversations and insists that the prisoners were the ones who built the tracks. Although she's experienced her own unusual events in the neighborhood, she's never encountered Frankenstein. I still wonder why I was the one to hear those sounds. Were they reaching out? Or was it just the silence of the night that allowed their anguish to fill the house? Was there something specific about 2 to 3 a.m. that kept the memory of their suffering alive? I don't have all the answers, only questions. But this experience opened me to the spiritual world, and though Frankenstein eventually faded, the encounters with the supernatural didn't stop. I have more stories. Tales of poltergeists and a house during college that I couldn't bear to stay in. But those are stories for another time. For now, these memories remain with me, a mysterious part of my childhood that shaped who I am. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. From 2000 to 2003, my family and I lived in a beautiful apartment complex in Silver Spring, Maryland. While it was a lovely place to call home, our stay was marked by a series of strange and unexplainable events that have stayed with me to this day. The first odd experience happened about a month after we moved in. I was 17, and my younger sister was 11. One night, I had a vivid dream where I saw our family deity. In our culture, we believe that each family has a guardian spirit or deity who watches over and protects us. In my dream, she told me there was something in our apartment, but that I didn't need to be afraid. She assured me she would take care of it. I didn't mention this dream to anyone, thinking maybe it was just a figment of my imagination. But a few days later, I was in the shower when I heard a sudden, loud scream. I rushed out, only to find my sister sobbing on the kitchen floor. She said that while she had been standing at the counter, something invisible had forcefully pushed her. She could even feel the distinct pressure of 5 fingers pressing against her back. This was no simple stumble. She was genuinely shaken. Not long after that, strange incidents started happening more frequently. One day, a battery-operated dog toy suddenly turned on by itself, moving and barking without anyone touching it. A toy piano did the same thing, playing random notes on its own. Once, while I was organizing my closet and listening to music on my stereo, I watched in disbelief as the volume display on the stereo started climbing up to max, without anyone touching it. We tried to brush it off as interference or static, but it still felt unsettling. Then, things like pills would go missing from their boxes only to be found later under our beds in perfect alignment, as if placed there intentionally. One night, I was alone working on the computer. The layout of my room was such that if you sat at the computer, your back would face the door. Next to the door, there was a lamp. While I was working, I felt a sudden, distinct presence behind me, as if someone had just entered the room. I turned around and noticed the lamp slightly swaying, as if someone had brushed past it. I knew I was alone and all the windows were shut, so there was no logical explanation for it. Feeling uneasy, I opened the walk-in closet, which we used as a small prayer room with idols and offerings. I went back to the computer, but no sooner had I sat down than the bulb in the lamp blew out. Thankfully, there were other lights on, but it felt ominous. I quickly left the computer and sat in the prayer room, waiting there until my family returned home. Another strange incident happened while my sister and I were watching TV one evening. I had a glass of orange juice and she had a glass of Pepsi. Suddenly, the cable cut out, which happened from time to time. We both got up to check the TV connection, leaving our drinks on the coffee table. When we came back, we found the orange juice poured into the Pepsi glass. Both drinks were mixed, which made no sense since we were sure neither of us had touched them. But the final incident was what finally made me open up about my dream. I've always been an avid reader, and at that time I shared a room with my sister. She was already asleep while I was reading, when suddenly, my bedside lamp went out. I assumed the bulb had burned out, but when I flipped the switch, the lamp turned back on as if someone had turned it off. Then I heard a distinct click, like someone had switched it off manually. This time, I turned the lamp back on, but within moments, it made a loud popping sound and the bulb burned out. Needless to say, I quickly closed my book and hid under my covers. But the real scare came hours later. I woke up in the middle of the night, probably around 2 or 4 a.m., to find every single lamp in the room switched on, except, of course, my reading lamp. Our bedroom had 4 or 5 lamps, all of which were now glowing brightly. I went to the bathroom, returned, and turned them all off, thinking that was the end of it. The next morning, my mom asked why I had left every lamp on all night. I told her I hadn't, explaining how I'd found them on and had turned them off around 4 a.m. But she'd come into the room at 7 a.m., and all the lamps were on again. This was when I shared my dream with my parents, and we decided it was time to consult our family astrologer back in India. The astrologer confirmed that there was indeed an entity in our apartment, one that had been there long before we moved in and wouldn't leave. He performed a cleansing ritual remotely and gave my sister and me protective talismans to wear for the rest of our time in the apartment. From that point on, the strange activity quieted down. Looking back, despite these eerie experiences, we actually enjoyed living there. The apartment was beautiful, and in some strange way, the energy of the place felt like it balanced out once we took steps to protect ourselves. Still, I'll never forget those strange, unexplained events and the presence that seemed to linger around us. For the past few years, I've been waking up with faint scratch marks all over my body. It wouldn't be so strange if I had pets or long nails, but I don't, so it's unnerving. It doesn't help that there are 4 ghosts in my house, but only one has followed me throughout my entire life, wherever I go. My family moves frequently since we're a military family, but no matter where we end up, he's always there. The first time I saw him, I was about 5 years old. I was sitting in front of a large, open window while my dad helped get me ready for school. My dad stepped away for a moment, and that's when I saw him. He had dark, curly hair, brown eyes, and wore a black coat. He looked young, maybe around 18, and had an expression that was both sad and curious. He might have been Latino, but I couldn't say for sure. When my dad came back into the room, the ghost disappeared. Even though he was skeptical, my dad believed me a little when I told him what I'd seen. Since that day, this ghost has followed me everywhere I've lived, even overseas when we moved to Germany. At first, he was just a shadow on the edge of my vision, a blurry figure that stayed at a distance. People brushed it off as a child's imagination, but as I've gotten older, his presence has changed. Now, he's no longer a vague shape in the background. I see him as an apparition, still shadowy but more defined, often staring at me from afar. I wouldn't mind him so much if he were like the other spirits I've encountered, quiet and curious. But at night, when I turn off all the lights, he comes closer. I'm terrified of the dark, so I keep a night light on. Yet, even with that, I can feel him lying beside me, close enough that I can barely breathe. The fear gets so intense that I cry out for one of my siblings. But the moment I do, he vanishes. Lately, I've noticed tiny, thin scratches on my lips, always on the small patch between my nose and upper lip. They heal quickly, but it's unsettling. Besides him, there are 3 other spirits in our current home. There's an older man who appears to be African American, perhaps in his late 40s. He has a serious, worn look, as though he's from the early 1800s. Then there's a young woman with long brown hair, wearing a simple sleeping gown. She seems nervous, hesitating near the edges of the room. I think she's probably in her early 20s and from the mid-1800s. And finally, there's a little boy, maybe 12 years old, dressed in clothing that looks like it's from the 1920s. The interactions between these spirits are strange. Whenever the man in the black coat enters a room where another spirit is, they all turn to look at him with expressions of almost pleasant surprise. The little boy especially seems drawn to him and will go stand by his side as if they share some connection. Once, I came home from school and found all 4 of them gathered in the main room, quietly observing each other. When I entered, they all turned to look at me. The sight of them together startled me so much that I ran out of the house and headed to a nearby park, not knowing what else to do. For a while, I sat alone on the last swing in a row of 5, just watching the small pond near the slides, trying to calm down. But then, I noticed something strange. The other swings were all wrapped tightly around the metal bar above, like they'd been twisted up by someone. There had been no breeze, and even if there had been, it wouldn't have been strong enough to lift those swings over the bar. The park was completely empty, so there was no one around who could have done it. I just sat there, staring, trying to make sense of it. More recently, strange things have started happening in the house again. One night, as I was putting my little sister to bed, I heard faint, soft sobbing coming from the closet. I've also seen odd, gentle bursts of white light outside, flickering in front of the house like they're trying to catch my attention. I don't know what any of this means, but it feels like these spirits are trying to tell me something, especially the man in the black coat who has been with me for so long. I'm not sure what he wants, but his presence continues to unsettle me. And though I can't see where this will lead, part of me feels like this story isn't over yet. I don't have any over-the-top ghost stories like the ones you see on TV, but I did experience some strange things in the house I lived in about 3 years ago. When I first moved in, I didn't feel anything unusual. It was a beautiful home with plenty of space and a big backyard. But over time, a few weird situations started happening. I was a teenager in high school then, and I'd often take afternoon naps, usually for about 2 hours. I'd lock my door and keep the light off since there was plenty of daylight streaming in. But sometimes I'd wake up at night with the light on. It always threw me off because I didn't like the thought of someone coming into my room while I was asleep. My first thought was that my dad or sister had come in, but every time I checked, the door was still locked. There's a logical explanation. I used to sleepwalk as a kid, so it's possible I could have turned the light on while sleepwalking and gone back to bed. But with other things that happened in that house, I don't think it was just me flipping the switch. The feeling of being watched was another thing. Some nights, I'd lie in bed and feel as if something was looking in my direction. I'd even see a shadow on the wall, a dark shape that would dash away when I looked directly at it. I tried to tell myself I was just imagining things, but then my cousin stayed over, and she told me something that changed my mind. To give you some background, my cousin is from the Philippines and says she has a third eye, or what some people might call a sixth sense. She says she once saw an old woman she didn't recognize, only to later realize it was our great-grandmother, whom she'd never met. I think our great-grandmother had already passed away by the time we were even born. She doesn't like this ability, and honestly, I don't blame her. One night, when she was staying over, she told me she'd seen something floating on the wall in our basement, a black shadow. That's when I realized I wasn't crazy after all. Either we both were, or there really was something strange in that house. I had another experience alone in the basement, sitting at our computer. I suddenly heard slow footsteps behind me, the kind of deliberate steps that make you think someone's there. I've been startled by my sister or dad sneaking up on me before, so I turned around, half expecting to see them. But this time I was alone. I had this eerie feeling that something was glaring at me angrily, but there was no one there. A friend of mine had a similar experience. He was using the computer one day and went up the stairs to my room. He said he got a weird chill down his neck and noticed light coming from under my door. But I was napping at the time with the door locked, and I hadn't turned on the light. When I woke up later, the light was off and the door was still locked. The whole situation was strange. The last experience I want to share happened after my family moved out of that house. My parents were selling the place because they'd found another home they liked better. They didn't believe in ghosts, but my sister and I both felt there was something in that house. By the time we moved, most of our furniture was gone. Only a few things like a desk and TV were left. My sister, who loves singing but is too shy to do it in front of others, was practicing with a karaoke machine set up by the TV. She was upstairs when she heard knocking coming from the basement. Thinking it was me, she went down to check, but no one else was in the house. She didn't tell me about it until much later when I mentioned that I thought the house might be haunted. I never knew much about the house or its history. I lived there for a few years through high school and part of college, but one of our neighbors had been there for about 30 years. I remember her mentioning a murder that happened in the neighborhood, but I never got to ask her more about it. She was also my boss, and she was pretty strict at work, so I didn't get the chance to ask many personal questions. Now I wonder if the murder she mentioned could have happened in my house. Back when I was 19, I moved into an apartment in Iowa City with my ex-girlfriend. Things were going great, and we were thrilled to be on our own. We didn't think twice about the fact that the complex was surrounded by a cemetery. But the events that took place there were enough to turn any skeptic into a believer. It started small, with lights flickering and strange noises, things we brushed off. But one day, I came home from work to find the curtains in our office wide open. Odd, since we always kept them closed. Then, about a week later, the same thing happened, except this time, the chair at the desk had been moved, facing out the window. Assuming my girlfriend was playing pranks, I called her, but she swore she had nothing to do with it. A couple of weeks later, things escalated. She called me in a panic, telling me to come home right away. When I got there, I found the curtains open, the chair facing the window, and her porcelain doll sitting in the chair. The view from that window, just the parking lot and the cemetery behind it. We were shaken. Not long after, we were taking a shower together. I was washing my face when she let out a scream. I looked down to see two figurines from a shadow box on the other side of the bathroom lying in the shower drain, as if something had thrown them at us. That was the last straw. We moved out shortly after. A few months went by, and my ex was now pregnant with our daughter. We'd hit a rough patch and eventually decided to part ways. After that, the strange events stopped. I enlisted in the Navy, and for years nothing unusual happened. But one night, I woke up in my barracks to my stereo blaring. I turned it off and went back to sleep, but when I woke up again, my floor lamp was broken in 3 places and shoved behind my desk, and my TV screen had 3 skinny lines across it, like someone had dragged fingers down it. There was no logical explanation. Time passed, and during a trip home, my ex and I reconnected and decided to get back together. We joked about the strange things that had happened in the old apartment, and she moved down to my duty station where we got another place together. Almost immediately, things picked up where they had left off, only worse. We began receiving strange, garbled messages on our answering machine, some up to 5 minutes long, ending in a scream that didn't sound human. We saved the messages, but my friends didn't believe us and teased me about it. One evening, a couple of friends were over, and one of them stood up and jokingly called out to whatever was causing the disturbances. Seconds later, we heard a loud bang from the hallway. I went to check on our daughter, worried she'd woken up, but she was sound asleep. Then I looked into the bathroom. The candles had been blown out, and all the pictures that were hanging on the walls were stacked on top of the toilet. I was the last one in there, just minutes before. We all freaked out and I grabbed my daughter and we left. As we were driving away, we saw the vertical blinds in her bedroom swinging back and forth. Now, at least we had witnesses to back us up. But we couldn't just up and move this time. We eventually had a priest bless the apartment. Oddly, when we left to meet him, every door in the apartment was wide open. But when we returned, all of them were closed, and my daughter's Elmo toy was positioned in the foyer, facing the door. The priest, clearly uncomfortable, admitted he wasn't qualified to handle an exorcism. We began noticing foul smells throughout the apartment, and the final straw came when I heard our daughter talking in her bedroom one night. When I checked, she was sitting up on her bed in the dark, talking to someone. When I asked who she was talking to, she said, "The witch in the corner." She stared and laughed, ignoring my questions. That was enough. We started packing to move, and a bunch of my Navy buddies came over to help. We turned off the lights and set up a camcorder. To everyone's shock, the recording showed unexplained orbs and a shadowy figure moving across the living room. My friends were speechless, and some even claimed to feel cold spots. Just like before, things didn't work out with my ex, and we eventually parted ways for good. But one last unsettling thing happened. When my brother visited, he said he heard strange noises from the bathroom, and when he peeked in, he saw a shadowy figure slam against the mirror. It was all way beyond normal. Years passed, and everything was calm, until recently. Now, I have a new fiancé, but we've been experiencing similar weirdness. In our previous house, we'd hear bangs in the middle of the night, and I once came home to find all my clothes in the closet pushed to one side, with several hangers neatly laid out on the floor. That same night, we heard what sounded like a little girl crying by the foot of our bed. Our American bulldog, normally calm, would occasionally growl into thin air with his hackles raised. One morning, my fiancée woke up with her hands around her neck, feeling like she was being choked. She couldn't move or see, just frozen with pressure around her throat. She said it lasted about 10 seconds, but when it stopped, there was nothing there. It felt like someone had broken in and tried to strangle her, but the room was empty. We bought several crosses for the house and set up a webcam at night. Things have mostly calmed down since, though we still hear the occasional banging and feel like we're being watched. Just a few days ago, we left to go to the store, and a friend of mine stopped by while we were out. He knocked and heard our dog barking and someone's voice inside, telling the dog to be quiet several times. My friend thought we were home, but when we didn't answer, he knocked louder. He kept hearing the dog barking and the same voice shushing him, but we weren't there. What is going on? About a week before what I believe was an encounter with an incubus, I had a vivid dream where I was pregnant with the devil's child. I think the dream may be connected, but I'll skip that part for now. About 8 nights later, I found myself feeling unusually restless and aroused, unable to sleep. I went to my closet to take care of business with the lights off, which was something I often did in that month, June 2010, and had come to enjoy. As an hour passed, I was getting close to an intense, hands-free climax. I felt a warm, tingling sensation, and then an unusual pressure that felt like a subtle mimicking of male touch. But as I got closer to climax, I found myself unable to focus on anyone I knew, including the person I was in a long-distance relationship with. Strangely, I started to imagine this being touching me, even though I hadn't heard of or thought about incubi before. The idea felt oddly natural, like it was stuck in my mind. At some point, I remember trying to picture this being, and briefly saw a large, muscular, shadowy torso in my mind's eye. The entire experience started feeling foggy, and I'm not sure if my eyes were open or closed. I felt more lost in the pleasure than ever before, and it was almost unsettling how intense the sensation had become. Then, something strange and eerie happened. When my eyes were open, I noticed a faint pair of neon yellow, almond-shaped eyes floating just a few inches above my left shoulder. A moment later, 2 more pairs of identical eyes appeared, faint and fixed on me from a spot in my closet above me. This vision only lasted about 10 seconds, and I couldn't look at all 3 pairs of eyes at once. Oddly, I didn't feel afraid or question what I was seeing. It wasn't until I heard thunder outside that I snapped out of it. The thunder, at first, sounded like a roar to me. A strange association since I'd never actually heard a real animal roar before. Looking back, I'm still surprised that the eyes didn't scare me, as if I'd been under some kind of spell. I was almost at my climax but paused because the thunder had startled me. Trying to finish, I continued, but as I got closer, the thunder clapped even louder, almost jolting me to a standstill. I began to feel as though the thunderstorm was somehow connected to my experience. Every time I came close, another loud crash of thunder would freeze me in fear. The power started flickering on and off, and I felt like something had left the closet and was moving around the room, trying to scare me. I didn't feel alone and started seeing faint white fog in the corners of my eyes. Though this could have been from sleep deprivation, I was beginning to feel guilty, uncomfortable, and exposed like I was being watched. The more clothes I put on, the more in control and less bothered I felt. After the storm cleared, I climbed into bed and immediately felt safe under the covers. I fell asleep quickly and woke up a few hours later feeling normal, though I had a lingering sense that I'd had some intense dreams. A week later, I still felt strange when thinking about that night, like something had indeed happened that I shouldn't encourage. Since then, I've found that praying and avoiding thoughts about the experience have helped stop an indescribable, almost addictive feeling from returning. I haven't had any similar encounters since that night.